Hello again, friends! And you are my friends, and welcome back to another edition of 605, the Superpodcast. The only podcast on Turner Time. The Mothership! The best wrestling podcast on the planet. The only wrestling podcast that matters. Call somebody. I'm your host, the great Brian Last. It's me! The hardest working man in wrestling podcasts.
Yeah! Baby.
So what are you trying to prove?
And I'm very happy to be joined once again by one of the most popular co-hosts in show history. He's done so much for the show, whether it's in the co-host chair or doing his many characters. And that, of course, is your friend and mine, Howard Baum. Howard, welcome back to the show.
Hey. Thanks for remembering, everybody.
Well, there it is, the usual hey that we're so used to. It's going to be an interesting open here. I got to say, before we went on the air, my headphones broke. One side, one headphone, I don't know what to call it. One side just broke, and I foolishly decided with these expensive headphones to do a Google search on how to fix them. And I took it apart, and in the midst of it, a spring that was in there popped out and flew somewhere in my office. So I'm operating with one ear, one side right now, one channel, and the other side is just blank. It's empty. It's the lights out match in the other ear.
And my head is half clogged up, so this is the audiophile special.
Well, I wanted you to be here to co-host this week. I wanted to get your thoughts on something. I recently saw, probably within the last month, you posted in the Mothership that you went to some event, and you posted some pictures and a few stories. You said there's more to the story that you'll talk about when you have an opportunity, and here's that opportunity. But you really haven't done much around wrestling in a long time. I can't think other than CAC. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. You could tell me that you do all these things, but I can't think of other events that you frequently go to. I know you don't really watch wrestling often. And you did go to this event, and it sounded interesting. What can you tell me about this show you went to?
Well, for years and years, my buddy, local wrestling pariah, self-described pariah. He may be a pariah, but he's my pariah. One of the men with the coolest evil names in the history of wrestling, my friend Lou Spector. He's been telling me, you got to come check out shows. And for years, I've been telling him they haven't invented a show that Howard Baum is going to go to as a fan. Until in November, they had a thing called Reefer Mania 3. Reefer Mania 3.
The third one.
Exactly. The first two were not on my radar at all, but Reefer Mania 3, and Lou's like, you got to come check this out. We walk inside, and it's like this Miami Vice warehouse all the way down in Miami, and the cops are doing security, and there's people around the block, and you walk inside to this cool industrial building in a truly smoky arena for reasons that will become apparent in a moment. Little ring set up in the middle, and the biggest open-air weed market you've ever seen in your entire life. Booth after booth of edibles, rollables, smearables, waxables, whatever the kids are into these days. Shrooms, you name it. Just booth after
Shrooms?
booth. Yeah.
How are they doing this in Florida? You're not in Washington State. You're not in Amsterdam. How are they doing this? I mean, Florida's a pretty strict place. I mean, I know you're in South Florida.
I hope I'm not, dropping a dime here, but cops were actively walking around. Cops were doing security outside. If you guys want to look it up, Reefer Mania 4 is coming up January 18th in Miami. And you can look at, they're on Facebook, Reefer Mania 4. It's not like I'm snitching on anybody. I even asked Lou, is it okay? How much should I talk about it? He's like, well, everyone knows about it. It's like they're publicizing it. So it's promoted by my friend JB Cool. His personal address is 1645. No. But JB Cool from the FEW, which I don't quite remember what that stands for, but there's a group in northern Florida, and they have a tagline, "We believe in wrestling." So the FEW, their tagline is, get this, "We make believe."
Interesting.
What do you think about that for a wrestling? Can you imagine the days of Luthez and Buddy Rogers at the Comiskey? Well, we make believe, folks.
I can't get over the fact that the cops are working security there, and when you say it's an open weed market, I mean, like there's gimmick tables with different.
Yeah. Instead of Barry Windham headshots, it's weed and weed and weed. I'll repost it to I put it up on the Mothership and I'll bump it. But, yeah, it's an open air weed market. Eighth, quarter, you name it. One guy, these two shirtless outlaw bikers, they had a bag of weed the size of a dog food bag with them. It was just insane. They had edibles everywhere. They had hot model girls walking around. This funky urban crowd. They're playing sick beats all night.
How many people?
And the wrestling
attend this.
Oh my God, a ton of people. And mind you, the wrestling was not the main attraction. It could have just as easily been a wet T-shirt concert or a contest or anything. Wrestling was not the draw because I asked people as I was walking around, and the crowd was like young, urban, hip people, and it was a bunch of hipsters and stuff. And there was no set seating. It was like kind of free range, and everyone's roaming around, buying stuff and smoking weed. And then the matches are kind of like an afterthought. They had like a hip-hop DJ come out, which really, if I'm honest, is what first drew me to professional wrestling to begin with, is my passion for Latina hip-hop. Exactly. And, I cherish those early memories of wrestling, so it was kind of a full circle moment for me. But some of the things my eyes witnessed on this night, on the way there, Lou said, you're going to see at independent shows these days that it's a pastiche of everything that has happened in wrestling in the last 20 years. So sure enough, every little scrawny indie guy gets in there, and the match starts with him doing a HBK foot stomp on the mat to get support. The next thing you know, they're doing a stunner and the Rock's move. And that's the first match. Because, like many a veteran greater than I has said, you just don't do that shit.
Yeah.
All the tenets are out the window. And let me tell you a little more about this show. Took a couple of notes here on what I witnessed. I took some pictures of this stuff. They had a weed in a suitcase match suspended above the ring, which wasn't that much of a prize because you could like fall over and fall face first into a bunch of weed.
Was it a ladder match? Was that?
Yeah. They had a ladder match, yeah. And a midget came out and brawled with a guy named Cha-Cha during this match, too. And I was still kind of stunned by just the visual of, like, a million people milling around smoking weed and wrestling and everything. So, then we got into our intergender midget match, which was not bad. And what was interesting, there were really no wrestling fans there. I asked all the weed dealers and a lot of the fans, I'm like, well, are you a wrestling person? And they're like, no, not at all. And so it was kind of like just something that was happening in the background, like a band, like, they didn't care. They weren't into it. But it was interesting to see the civilian and the new crowd and the modern people pop for old established spots like midget spots and Rikishi's butt in the face spot that haven't been seen by human eyes in many a year. Things straight out of the 1930s fairgrounds, these midget spots and everything, and they're doing them for naked virgin eyes, and people are reacting to it and popping for it. Even I was. I'm like, oh my God, they're doing this in 2019, like all these midget spots. So what was interesting?
Did one of the midgets bite the referee's ass?
I think they left that one out. I think things have progressed a little since Little Louie's days, Bobo Johnson. But what was really, truly a test of why it is important to be a professional wrestler is because a couple of the matches did feature real professional wrestlers. And is it Mascara Sagrada or Mascarada Sagrada Jr.?
Mascara Sagrada is full size. Mascarita Sagrada is the mini version of Mascara.
Okay, well, it was the big guy. I thought his dad was somebody because he's a junior. So it's Mascara Sagrada Junior. My accent is really on display for this one,
Awful.
folks. Thank you. Thank you. I'm usually a little more fluid than that, but he worked against a guy who looked like a decent, good worker, and the crowd actually started paying attention to it. They started doing some lucha spots and back and forths and everything, and for the first match on the card, both guys looked like they were in shape and competent and were what we like to call workers, competent workers. And I'm like, wow. I turned to my friend Lou and I said, see, that's real wrestling for the first time tonight. Then they were followed by a guy in a judge suit who worked against a guy in a bunny suit. So by this point in the evening, I'm stoned to the gills and we're sitting in the front row because things just maneuvered that way. Like people got up, people sat down, and I'm sitting there. I'm like, entertain me. There's a dog walking around. There's a girl covered with sparkles next to me. There's like all kinds of stuff going on. And
How many
I see
people
these
are
two
actually
idiots.
sitting down? How many people are actually sitting down versus wandering around, walking around the room?
Oh, just tons. I mean, I'm horrendous at counting crowds, but easily thousands. I mean, a couple thousand in a cool space. It would be like the ECW arena packed to the gills, packed with weed, with a ring in the middle of it, and it was just like
That
people
was the
from every
ECW
walk of.
arena.
Yeah, really. I'm glad I made it up there. It was cool to actually see the arena in person. But anyway, yeah, so I'm sitting there in the front row, and now I'm like stoned, and I'm just like, okay, now it's full circle. From the 9-year-old boy who worked into the Miami Beach Convention Center in 1974 to witness his first match, made his way all the way to ringside, hobnobbed with everybody. Now I'm sitting front row at a show, completely unknown, after 15 years after attending my last show, and like, this is it, the full circle moment. And these two idiots come out in a judge outfit and a bunny outfit. So I lost it. And I scared the girl in the knee-high socks next to me. She moved discreetly 2 seats over. I said, hey, Buddy Rogers and Antonina Rocca are spinning around in their graves like a rotisserie chicken right now. What do you think you're...
I thought that's who you saw, Bunny Rogers.
That was what's his name? A Pfeffer gimmick, right?
I don't know.
Bunny Rogers and
he had Bummy Rogers
and Hobo Brazil. I like that.
You saw Bunny Rogers. He had Bummy Rogers.
So then the hipsters next to me were laughing, and nobody appreciated any of these wrestling references. And I'm like, but do you even know what I'm talking about? Have you ever heard of Jack Briscoe, John Tolos, Jerry Lawler, Dusty Rhodes? Do you even know what I'm saying? And I didn't know if he heard me or what, even though I was 3 feet away from him. And he turns around and he goes, shut up. And he got no pop. And I go, oh, that's some real Fred Blassie crowd work, which got a pop from my little crowd. I go, but you don't know who that is either. And this just points to the problem of there being no gatekeepers in wrestling. Because you could say, what does it matter in 2020 if there's humor, if there's this or that, everyone's smart to it. But no, they kept this out for a reason, because 20 years from now, wrestling is going to be nothing like wrestling. We're going to think these are the old days of Gotch and Fez when you look at what's going to be happening in 20 years. Because when I was 10, I saw Dick Slater, Bob Roop, King Curtis. And then later in my life, when I got into the business and did whatever I did, I always said, if I do anything around wrestling, I'm conducting myself like those guys. That's wrestling. And a guy who's 35 now, he says that about Scott Hall or whatever he witnessed 25 years ago or whatever it may be. And so by letting these clowns in, and the Russos and the bad influences and the bad comedy and the skits and the monologues, none of that was wrestling. Which is why I always say, you can't judge today's product by professional wrestling standards.
Then what do you judge it by?
You've got to call it sports entertainment. You got to call it its own thing.
Was there anyone on the show? I mean, this is South Florida. I can imagine there's only a certain pool of wrestlers. Was there anyone you knew from the old days? Like, was Malia
you know what's funny?
on the show?
No, I didn't bump into her, even though we would have kayfabed each other if we did. But it's just a tradition we have. There's no actual heat. We just like to kayfabe each other, and then if we're forced to say hello, we do, and then we go back to kayfabing each other. So I don't know. But no, I was actually expecting to have a nice reunion with all my South Florida indie buddies and such, but nobody would work the show. They didn't want to get the stink on them. They didn't want to get busted or raided.
The literal stink.
I say stink in the best sense of the word, mind you, because it was the coolest wrestling show I've been to in a long time. And I'm sure all these guys wanted to work it, but it's not the best for publicity. Like Gangrel is working with the Davey Mayor and all this stuff, running high class shows, and so there's a whole pool of people that can't be used in this highly seemingly illegal operation. But no, to answer your question, no, there were no reunions. I did attend a Gangrel show after that, which was kind of interesting, and it kind of also underlined my points that I was making about indie wrestling, because I was kind of everything is such a format now. Like at every show you see, there will be the three guys with the handy cams just standing up, roaming around at will, shooting the stream for their YouTube channel or whatever it is. But in the old days, we were taught to stay out of the way so the wrestlers could actually get the attention and don't get in the paying fans' way. Crouch down in a corner. Don't be seen. And then, from the first match on, well, I'm not going to bury Gangrel's show because he's a friend of mine, but once again in the middle of the show the Samoans came out. El Hijo de Samu and El Hijo de Tonga Kid came out, the Samoans, the new generation of the Samoans, and they cleared the ring, and all of a sudden a wrestling show broke out in this independent show, and I'm like, oh damn, that's some real heat, that's some real excitement, that's some real action, and then we're throwing some guys around. It just shows you the difference between, you can't shit on a student, you got to learn somewhere, but these cosplay people and what's going on in the comedy, somebody who's 10 years old now is going to think that's cool, and they're going to pervert it even further 20 years from now.
It's interesting because when the UFC got really popular, I certainly thought that we would see wrestling kind of go a little bit more in that direction, more serious, more submission moves, trying to bring some realism back into wrestling just because the UFC was so popular, mixed martial arts was so popular. And that's where wrestling started, was as a shoot, and then it devolved into what it is now. But it's kind of gone the other way. It's gotten sillier. And I don't even know if it's gone the other way or just that the people who do the silly stuff are the people now in charge. If the indie show is run by the silly guy and all the matches are going to be silly and have gimmicks and everyone's flipping, then you have to do that if you want to work there.
You know what's fascinating about that? When AEW first started, in my mind, I thought that they were going to win the war with WWE because they were going to have a New Japan approach to their matches and to their presentation. And I think that's what they should have done. I think they should have taken NJPW action style and then put their own twist on it, which I will call Factor X. Fill in the blank, do your own thing. Don't make it a derivative of Vince, please, because everything they do trickles down to TNA and every crappy indie group from there on down. Do you start doing the long interview? Every shitty group after that has to do the long interview. Do your own thing. That's why Paul Heyman was a genius. He's the only one who cracked me out of my wrestling fan stupor in 1994 to pay attention because something was happening that was different, that was not a part of the same fucking formula that these people just lazily trot out because Vince did it on Wrestling Superstars. And it kills me, the lack of imagination. And, I look around at the product, which I've been ignoring for so long, and it's exactly what I thought it would be. It's just a derivative of a backstage skit, of a logicless angle. And by the way, wrestling is so redundant these days. There's like 650,000 hot goth girls, 850 shine stardom Japanese girls, all with the same body, 675,000 hot girls, all these guys who are exactly the same. If 300 of them died tomorrow, you would never know. Now it's what I like to see. It's heartening. I like Christian Cage. He stands out as a big monster. I like some of these new guys. Or who's that big guy that was in Impact for a while?
Brian Cage?
Yeah. I have a mental block when it comes to that name. I hate that name.
What do you mean?
I'm kidding. But no, yeah. I mean, he stands out because he's a monster, and they got some big fat guys now, like those ones WWE poached. And that's good. It's diversity, but it's so redundant. I mean, this week in Boning Up, since it's been a while since I made an appearance, I wanted to be current with the wrestling world, and I said, well, I broke out of my Rumpelstiltskin stupor and attended 2 actual live shows. Why don't I just check out what's going on TV? So the thing is, I looked at about 2 minutes of each TV show, and I'll just give you a brief rundown. I'm not even going to consult my notes.
2 minutes.
And it's just, I wanted to be up to date with you and discuss anything that might come up. So
what do you
WWE,
have? So what do you have? You have cable, so you can see the WWE, but can you see the smaller groups that are not on a USA or a TNT?
Yeah, I dug some shit up. So, just the thumbnail my week's worth of viewing just very lazily, very quickly, and I guarantee you I didn't watch more than 5 minutes of any of these programs, but WWE Raw, I fucking hate WWE. There's my review. I don't care what they do at this point. They can bring Superstar Graham back and crown him as champion with his, he can, even if he grows his sideburns back, I'm not going to be a fan. I'm done with them. There's nothing they can do for me as a fan. I hate their presentation. I hate their announcers. I think King is doing better than he ever has done, though. I think he's really good out there. I think he's like holding the mantle for,
it's tough with Lawler because you've seen Lawler at his peak. You've seen great Lawler in Memphis as a babyface or as a heel. Mm-hmm. So when you see the WWE version of him, you just know how much better he could be. And I mean, he's better now than he had been in the past, especially during the Attitude Era where he was just completely fucking goofy and, puppies!
No, he was a joke. That was embarrassing.
Yeah.
I burned my King Lawler shirt from 1983 that I got after I saw that nonsense. No, but I mean, he's at least a throwback to to trying to, put some breadcrumbs in the hamburger mix of professional wrestling, like trying to put that old style tradition into the commentary, because these young people don't know. How are they to know? So yeah, that's it for Raw. WWE sucks, and I hate him. And by the way, I'm not one of these partisan people. It just happens I'm always in lockstep with Cornette because we're both raised on professional wrestling, and he's a genius, and I don't put myself in his category. But I don't take sides. I'm not like, I want AEW to fail because Cornette doesn't like him, or, I hate NWA because Cornette was on there. It's not. It has nothing to do with Cornette. And matter of fact, I don't even know why I'm bringing him up. But I just know that there's so much divisiveness now. Like, yeah, I hate WWE, but one of my main motivations for me wanting to see AEW succeed, or at least spark another Monday Night War, is because it would be healthy for wrestling, and it would be, we're all in the wrestling business, so to speak, if we're auxiliary characters, and we're all trying to do something with it. So if the industry is healthy, then that's good for us, and it gives us more to do, everybody. And the thing is, now the writing's kind of on the wall. They're like Nitro Light, and the bloom is off the rose, and they've done several embarrassing things. And if I were them, I would have done NJPW Action plus, something that's your own, but not that has been done before.
Well, here's part of what I think the problem is that imagine when you were growing up watching Florida. Imagine if Eddie Graham was completely hands-off, and he said, Dusty, I want you to book. And Buddy Colt, you're also going to book a separate part of the show. And Mike Graham, I want you to book part of the show. So there's no centralization. Even though people say, it's, Tony Khan's the main booker, it all comes from Tony. You have guys that he's empowered who have completely, well, I shouldn't say they all do, but several of them have different views than the other ones do. And that's where you have a little bit of a problem. That's why that show feels so clunky and it feels so all over the place, because you can go from a serious segment with Cody Rhodes. And by the way, I know everyone's saying, please don't talk modern wrestling. We're almost done. I promise you folks. You can go from Cody Rhodes to a women's match that goes for 15 minutes to then some goofy shit that you don't want to see because it feels like WWE light, like you just said before.
Yeah. And it is clunky. And you know what was a disappointing moment for me was the MJF Jericho confrontation, because there's another missed opportunity. You have Jericho, the god of professional wrestling, the return of the Lord's son himself, Chris freaking Jericho, right? And what do they do out there with MJF, arguably today's like rising hottest heel, I understand? Is that accurate, or am I
would say so,
things?
Because he's young and he's a fantastic promo. And he is someone that if I had to put money on someone for the future, I'd put money on him. Because he's done some of the goofy stuff, and at this point everyone has. Because again, if you're coming up in a wrestling world where every independent show, just about every independent show has silly stuff, has dance routines, has guys in costumes, has dick flips, has invisible men. If that's on the shows and you need to get booked, before you know it, you end up having to do it too.
Right. It's like being a band. It's like being a bland or bland. It's like being in a band in 1973 and you got to play Dream On because that's how you get booked.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the problem. So, I mean, he could do the serious stuff, and he's fantastic on the mic. But,
Right.
Everyone now, just there's no feeder system without the stupid shit. And that's part of the problem. But like you said,
I do say for his gimmick, though, strictly speaking for his character, though, if he's that rich, A, he can afford to buy a new scarf once in a while. And also, I'd have that thing removed from my neck, or at least looked at the very least.
What thing on his
And
neck?
that's my only critique. Other than that, he seems like a nice landsman, and I wish him all the best. I do think he has an old-school delivery and a kind of a tongue-in-cheek kind of like he knows he's being a heel, but he's not breaking from it either.
No, he doesn't break at all. I mean, never breaks.
Right.
Which is good.
Right.
I wish there were more people like that.
No, totally. I mean, if I was a wrestler today, you wouldn't see me on Twitter except to be a heel. It's redundant by now to say, oh, these people thanking their opponents and all this shit. Come on. Because everybody just wants see, wrestling became another way of putting yourself out there in this narcissistic society of ours. These people were not raised on Jack Briscoe. They were raised on YouTube videos, and they just want to put something sparkly on and get attention.
See, it's sad that the segment you saw was the one with him and Jericho. I know a lot of people liked it, but I actually didn't because Jericho had been really good in AEW, and MJF is a fantastic talent. But to me, I saw that segment, and I thought it was too much like WWE.
Totally. I mean, they have to bicker back and forth. And how about some real-life heat? King of Wrestling, Chris Jericho. And by the way, you know what kind of a vibe that Chris Jericho gives off? It's the kind of a vibe where you were in a shit-hot local rock band in 1987, and you had a local hit on the radio maybe, and you'd get laid every night of the week, and you look like Steve Vai. Well, now you fast forward, and it's 2013, you're 50 years old, and you're still trying to do the same routine, trying to pick up a 20-year-old waitress, and wondering why you look like an idiot with your dyed frizzy hair and your bangles because you didn't make it and now it's too late. And that's the vibe he gives. It reeks of desperation. And what's so funny to me is how he's such a divisive character, because half the audience out there, probably less than half, I'm sure more will agree with me because they're more in my age group and they've seen, the people that we usually discuss. But a lot of younger people, he's the god. They lump him in with Flair and Briscoe, like however good anybody was. Oh, San Martino, and then, of course, Jericho. To me, Jericho was never better than third from the top. And I don't know what his come-to-God moment was, when Austin caught a gusher against Hart, and then he cut Austin 316, and Stone Cold was born, or Briscoe and Funk made their names, or what was Chris Jericho's crowning moment where he gets to be the most decorated, celebrated, talked about champion in the same breaths as these legends? I don't see it. And I wish somebody would explain it to me. Perfectly capable, a professional, a tough man, stood up to Goldberg, might be a nice guy, have no idea, never met him. But it's just a very Mickey Rourke vibe he's given off lately with all these desperation moves. Oh, I'm 50. It's time to get a sleeve tat. You're only young and cute when you're young and cute. That shit doesn't work. It's not going to work for David Lee Roth. It's not going to work for Chris Jericho. And just buying your jacket from the same company is not going to do it. And in addition to that, the Canadian accent is the least scary accent that you could possibly come up with. Like if they let Archie Goldie the Stomper talk and he sounded like Chris Jericho, he'd be in the second match. Hey, I'm gonna, you're on the list. Why? What's with all the comedy? What is with all the comedy, by the way? He's Mr. I come from Jack Briscoe, I come from Ric Flair, and he's like, I'm the champion, the bubbly. Why does he insist on the bad humor and the list and all that? Why not? I mean, I don't get the appeal of that. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, what is that weird comedy that he injects?
I can't answer your question, but I know what you're saying.
Like, why does he think it's cool? Why do other people think it's cool? How is that becoming of a world champion? How is that cool in any way? That disastrous, abysmal promo that he cut in his hot tub, trying to drink a bottle of champagne coherently, just filmed in his backyard in Tampa on a whim. Like, what is this?
Well, that was after the title belt had been stolen, I believe.
Right.
And the reputation was starting to go around that Jericho may like to consume, a little bit. And he kind of owned it. Instead of, running from it, the little bit of the bubbly thing came out of that.
Yeah. But I mean, geez, Le Champion and all that. And I don't know what's going on with his body. And I don't know what's going on with his head. He's apparently going to the Steven Seagal Institute for Hair Restoration or something.
Oh, come on.
Far be it from me to jinx the hair gods. At my advanced age, I am holding on proudly to every follicle that I can muster, and I don't want to anger the hair gods. I'm very fortunate because when I look through my Facebook, everybody I went to school with looks like Alfred Hitchcock. So I'm very fortunate. Even though in the morning light I'm starting to become a Lon Chaney Jr. character, but that's completely beside the point. Yes, where were we? Shitting on Chris Jericho's hair, yeah.
Well, you were.
So what I don't get is, I understand hair products and, age and everything, but it's kind of like Chris Jericho as a world champion wrestler and rock star is like one of those girls you see at the mall with the fake hair, lips, boobs, ass, and from afar you go, that's a hot girl. And then you get up to them, and they're like something out of Madame Tussauds. It's kind of a smoke and mirror thing with him because I don't understand how the sum of his work or the individual parts of his work amount to anything where he gets this level of respect.
I understand what you're saying. I can't answer for Chris Jericho.
I was looking for a counterpoint, but I remember that you don't like him either. So.
Well, no, I have liked him in AEW. I have thought, for the most part, there are things lately, the MJF promo you mentioned before I didn't really like, but there's a lot that I have liked. And I also think he needs to go to the gym. And, who am I to say that? I'm just someone who watches wrestling.
Yeah, but I think he has some weird body stuff going on. I mean, I don't know what's going on with that. Like he had he has that Scott Steiner chest thing, which is uncontrollable. And then, at old age, I mean, yeah, anybody I'm sure at his age would like to look like that. But yeah, it's just, I just don't get, I respect him as a wrestler and the fact that he came from the old school, and I'm not shitting on him. I'm just saying that he overachieved to a point that I don't understand. Like, I don't not like him. I don't watch his matches and say, oh, this guy completely sucks. But I don't see him as this, the guy they put on a pedestal like that. So anyway, that's about all the Jericho. I want to complete my little tour of my Rumpelstiltskin wrestling tour. I tuned into NXT for a minute. And the only comment I can say is I saw the guy come out who looks like he's from the 1930s, who looks like he weighs like 140 pounds. You know who I'm talking about?
I'm not sure. Jack Gallagher?
Yeah. Okay. So this is like if a toddler watched wrestling. This is the review that you would get. It's like someone who never watched wrestling before. It's nice. It's refreshing that I haven't watched any of this shit, and now I can view it and comment on it. So anyway, I didn't watch more than 2 seconds of it. It's apparently hosted by a guy in a tiny suit and a leprechaun. That's all I could gather.
Are you sure you watched NXT? I don't know.
A leprechaun. Have you seen the team that hosts the leprechaun? They have this big guy who's wearing one of these like thin cut suits like the kids wear these days, which is such a regrettable fashion choice. If you're going to wear a suit, kids, get a classic cut suit. Look classy and you don't need these guys. Don't need these tight leg jeans. Your ankles don't need to be showing when you're wearing a suit. Have some class. Watch a Cary Grant movie. That's not a suit. That's
now you sound like an old man. Have some class. Watch a Cary Grant movie.
You're gonna look back on this in 10 years and say, oh, well, look at those. Look at every guy has like a gun because he's wearing these like James Corden pants. Come on. So last but not least, I check out NWA. Even had to go onto the computer for that. Couldn't do that through the TV. And that proves that even when a company gets it, so to speak, they don't get it. Now, back to my point about not being a Cornette guy or a Cornette apologist, even though I seem to agree with everything he ever says, I thought he was the best thing about that show. And it really was just so fitting to hear his voice coming from that studio and that setting. And it's the only time that I would like to have heard the voice of Tony Schiavone. I detest Tony Schiavone as an announcer. I hate the tone of his voice, his used car salesman-ish delivery, his overly cloying, style. But I would have liked to have seen Tony Schiavone in that environment. Schiavone and Cornette, that would have been nice. Haven't really seen much of it, except to say that they're trying to present it like the old school product in front of modern eyes. It's completely out of time. It doesn't work in this, and they're trying to do the cutesy stuff now. So you have all these groups. AEW gets the opportunity to do strong style. NWA has the opportunity to do old style NWA. And yet, nobody somehow knows how to do professional wrestling.
Well, no one knows how to do it, but the other problem is the fans. I mean, I think with a studio setting, one of the biggest mistakes was inviting the usual fans to go there. It should have been no tickets on sale, and they should have gotten kids. They should have gotten old people. They should have gotten a different audience than just a bunch of white guys between the age of 25 and 48, because they're reacting in a fake way so that it doesn't seem genuine. I mean, I can go off about a whole number of other things there, but I think that's part of the issue, is if you want to present something that has the feel of what old school wrestling had, you need to try to replicate what the audience was to the best of your ability.
Yeah. The thing is, the whole thing, the people have lost their innocence. You'd have to look far and wide to find people stupid enough to accept professional wrestling on its face in a small studio. I mean, you really would have to go to the home for the demented and small children. And by the way, here's a little sidebar that I always found humorous. Like the old school workers, this is completely unrelated, but just bear with me for a minute. All the old workers would say, "Oh, we had them hanging on every this and that. I had them in the palm of my hand." But who are you really fooling? Like, they wheel these people in from the home. I'm not going to start insulting the audience like somebody who will go unmentioned. But I mean, it's not like they're performing in front of the most astute members of society, shall we say. In most cases, they're not pulling the wool over the most intelligent of our population, and they're so proud of their psychological manipulations, but it might be in front of a 9-year-old kid or something, and that counts as like, oh, we really had him that night. You know what I mean?
Well, I'll tell you what, Howard, let's move away from this, because I'm sure everybody's sick of contemporary wrestling.
I was drifting. Sorry about that.
But let's talk about something else, something that's been in the news, especially in the Mothership Facebook group. I was sent a copy of this book by a member of the group. I don't know. I guess he kind of publicly made a post. I'll give him credit. John Lee put this book up. Reportedly, several days ago on Facebook, the Hangman, you may remember him from 605s in the past, the Hangman Bruce Pobans posted that anyone who wanted his book could just message him, and he would email them a copy of the book. Now this, and I assume email. I don't know what other method he would have used. This is a book I've wanted to get my hands on for quite a while, because we've heard about it, we heard him talk about it, but no one actually saw or had a physical copy. We'd only heard that the Hangman wrote a book. And based on his reputation, I wanted to see this. For those of you new to the show, the Hangman Bruce Pobans was a man who made many fantastic claims about his wrestling career, even attending Cauliflower Alley with the other veterans. And it has been determined by every single historian or wrestling fan that has researched his career that it was all bullshit. He was actually asked not to come back to the Cauliflower Alley Club ever again. So this book was kind of like a holy grail. What did he write in this book about his fantastic career? And
what didn't he write in his book?
Well, now we have it here. I want to get your thoughts. I know you had a chance to skim through it, Howard, but let me start by a quote here from the book. I have a few things that we'll talk about. It says, "I talk about the CAC because at their annual reunion, they host an awards dinner on Saturday night where they honor around 10 or so workers from the business. In fact, in 2005, I have been informed that my name was chosen as one of the honorees." For the record, he was not honored in 2005. I don't know who would have informed him of that, but that's kind of the tone of the book. He says a lot of things, none of it's verifiable about wrestling, at least. I mean, apparently him and his wife really did run through the streets with the Olympic torch, but the wrestling stuff is out of control. What were your general thoughts? I don't know how aware of the Hangman you are, but what did you think skimming through this?
Well, first of all, he's a truly gifted writer that needs to be acknowledged right off the bat.
Each page is like 2 paragraphs.
Oh my God, it's like And I mean, it kind of defies imagination. Brian sent me the manuscript about a week ago, but I've been unseasonably busy due to the holidays and such. So I looked at it all today, and I said, how am I going to remember all of this? But it's so outrageous. How can you not remember it? Like, I was racking my brain, like, if I'm going to write a book, how many stories do I have? And he has like 4 famous wrestler stories in there. And one of them revolves around a multi-page story about eating crab legs with Bobo Brazil. That's one of the standout memories from his career, how they held up a completely fictitious story, meanwhile, that happened about how wrestlers like to, take advantage of buffets. So me and Bobo Brazil go to this buffet in St. Pete, and we ordered the crab legs, and the woman brings us out 4 crab legs that look like fingers. And we ordered another 4, and they came out 45 minutes later. I mean, I don't know. This guy's tripping. His Andre the Giant story was, I showed up to the arena. He doesn't say which town or what era this was.
I'm going to stop you here. I'm going to read this excerpt.
Right.
This is his chapter 10 from Hang In There. Andre the Giant. The late 70s, I was traveling up and down the highways, hitting almost every town possible, jobbing my heart out just to make a name and a few dollars. While setting up future booking dates, I was offered a gig I could not say no to. All I had to do was to get down to Texas, and I'll make an easy $1,000. I had a couple days between shows, so I took my time. That morning, I got into town, and I looked for the arena. As I drove up, I noticed out on the marquee, the Hangman versus Andre the Giant.
Right. That's the part that got me. That's the part that really got me. Like, when do they ever do that, much less under those circumstances? With no build-up, it's just out of the blue, the Hangman and Andre the Giant.
Well, I never met this Andre, but I heard stories about him. He was just starting out in the business, they say. I parked my car and walked inside to find the office. Inside, sitting at a desk, was the promoter. It's just, you know what it is? Even his stories, like the attempts to add descriptive detail are so banal.
Right.
So insipid. Like, I walked in and there was a man at a desk. Like, it's so...
Right. Like, if you were a Starsky and Hutch scriptwriter who had to do a wrestling episode, like, well, what happens in wrestling? Oh, they drive a lot. Oh, the car trips were brutal. We were known to blah, 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 pop a gasket. Like, everything you've ever heard around wrestling, he just takes it, like, from wherever and puts it into his own life. I mean, it's outrageous. I thought we actually stopped picking on him because it became too pathetic of a character, but...
Well, the release of his book...
I guess the moratorium is off due to his crimes against nature.
I introduced myself and sat down. We talked about what he wanted in the ring, and he inquired about my availability for future shows. I wanted to take a few days off and rest up before I had to fly to Japan.
Right.
So I only agreed to one more gig, which would be the which would be the day after next. Still giving me plenty of time to make my next gig. We made an agreement that if things worked out with the fans, I would return. Things were great. The fans gave me enough heat that after the first night, we agreed on a return match. When we chatted, the door to this office burst open, and standing before us was a giant of a man. He was so tall that we could barely see his head. What does that mean?
That's pretty tall.
Andre had the biggest head.
Maybe he was still outside the door.
He entered by ducking down and coming inside.
See, there you go.
Another much smaller man was at his side that did much of the talking. Andre spoke a few words in English, so his partner would translate when needed. I sat there almost frozen in my chair. The promoter and Andre talked briefly about tonight's match, and Andre left to go eat. After I calmed down and checked my shorts, I told the promoter he better pay me now. I was not sure what would happen that night, but I never worked with anyone that big. My job was to pick up and body slam Andre that night.
Right.
All I could think about was breaking my back. So after much heated discussion, I got my pay in cash and left to go find a local bar. A couple beers later, it was time to head back to the arena. In the dressing room, I tried to chat with Andre and discuss the body slam. He was not sure how to do it, so we walked it through. Before the match, his helper told me Andre was not happy with the body slam, but I informed him that that is what the promoter wants. So he went back to Andre as I finished getting ready. The match was a back and forth event. Andre did not sell that much, but when he hit me, I was doing backflips from his clothesline. In the 70s, by the way, let me just say that.
Right, not even invented yet.
After about 10 minutes, the call for the body slam came. In the middle of the ring, I laid a few chops into Andre, and I bent down, and I set up for the slam. My right arm went between his legs, and my left arm barely reached up to his shoulder. Andre clearly did not want to be slammed because he froze stiff and refused to work with me. After 2 failed attempts and some heavy grunting on my part, the third time was the charm. I got Andre up off his feet and turned him around. I got his legs over my head, and I cradled his neck as I brought him down for the intense slam. This ended up as the finish, as I quickly lay across his chest for the pinfall.
Right, repeat that part. I didn't want to laugh over that. It was so royal I couldn't hold it in. Repeat that last part.
This ended up as the finish, as I quickly lay across his chest for the pinfall. Not sure if I jumped on Andre for the pin, or I fell on him from exhaustion, but the win was mine nonetheless.
After a shoot body slam, no less.
After a shoot body slam on Andre the Giant, who's so big he couldn't see his head, he pinned him.
Holy
shit. The body slam, we'd always heard that he had claimed that he body slammed Andre, and that was so ridiculous. Because we know all the names of everyone who's ever slammed him.
Right. Connect, Race.
Not the Hangman Bruce Poe bands.
Right.
But I never knew that he also claimed that he pinned him in Texas.
Right.
Right after this happened.
As just a fly-in, by the way. No build-up, just
a drive-in.
The Hangman. Early in Andre's career, no less.
Yes.
So this is like 1968?
Andre started wrestling in the late 60s, but this, apparently, according to the Hangman, this took place in the 70s.
Right, exactly. He's all over the place.
2 days later, I met up with Andre again, and I'll tell you, he does not forget. My advice is never upset the Giant. The match this night was a total disaster for me. Andre did not sell any of my moves, no matter how hard I tried to hit him. In what was a one-sided battle quickly ended in less than 2 minutes. In what was a one-sided battle quickly ended in less... That's a horrible sentence. I tried to do a flying body press against Andre. I slipped and fell off him, or maybe he just swatted me away like an annoying fly. The latter is more like it. Lying flat on my back, looking up at the floodlights, made me wonder what I was doing. Without warning, Andre stepped one leg over my prone body and plopped his butt on my face and chest. I tried to kick out with my legs, but Andre would not have any of it. I was gasping for air and trying to speak, but all I had was this big man's butt in my face and about 500 pounds crashing down on my chest. I do not recall if I gave up or the ref called for the bell, but whatever happened, I was still alive. Barely. The next thing I recall is being strapped down on a stretcher and being wheeled out to the backstage and into a waiting ambulance. As they were wheeling me away from the ring, Andre was smiling as he was saying something like, "Payback is a bitch." This story is so fantastical that it's incredible.
And, you know, his fabulous entertainment career was not just limited to wrestling, you recall.
Oh, no, we will get to that.
Okay, lead me.
For the next 2 days, I was recovering in a local hospital. I checked out of the hospital and made my trip to Japan a little worse for wear. Years later, Andre and I went at it again, and we joked about our first encounter. I learned that even if the promoter demands a body slam, and Andre says no, that means Andre does not get slammed. Never mess with the giant. It's like you said, it's like he must be a real fan. And he's heard various stories about Andre, and he just took various aspects from different generic stories. And applied
could Andre drink?
Story.
His hand was bigger than the whole beer bottle. I swear to God. He had at least 75 that night.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, he was one of a kind. He liked me.
You mentioned his career as an entertainer before he got into wrestling. Apparently he had a pretty storied career as an entertainer as well.
Quite varied. Worked with John Belushi numerous times, if I recall.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, he placed it, how does he phrase it in the book? He's like, I worked with famous actor John Belushi in the Blues Brothers, and I also worked with him again in another small role. Like, he puts himself right in, he was like an extra, you know, if he was that.
Well, that's nothing. I got to sing with Alice Cooper, Johnny Cash, and George Burns.
I would love to see him on stage with Johnny Cash. I was so envisioning that.
I appeared with Kenny Rogers, Dottie West, Little Richard, Styx, and Jerry Lee Lewis. He must have worked security for some place.
Exactly. That's the vibe I got, exactly. Because he's close enough to, like, have those names. And how specific is this? His 1 month stint on stage, if you could picture this, as a singer and dancer with Wayne Cochran himself.
That's right.
Of all fucking things.
Wayne Cochran and the CC Riders.
How funny.
Yeah.
How funny.
Here's a quote that I liked. Out of nowhere, a picture of Gordon Soley in the book.
I know, with nothing apropos surrounding it. It's like I thought it's going to be a whole thing on Soley, and it segued into something else.
Gordon Soley, the dean of pro wrestling, the man who talked me back into wrestling after my stroke.
Thank you, God.
And bless you. Hang in there.
Oh, my God. See, I was skimming too fast. I didn't even read that caption. Holy shit. Congratulations on your stroke from beyond the grave from Gordon Soley, who couldn't defend himself.
That's almost every story in the book. I mean, other than Hulk Hogan, who no one is going to be able to track down and ask about. Right. If anyone got to him, the last thing they're going to ask about. Other than me, it's the first thing I would ask about. But most people, if you get Hulk Hogan, you're not going to go, tell me about the Hangman. It's Andre the Giant. It's Bobo Brazil. It's Gordon Soley. It's Dick the Bruiser. It's a bunch of guys. No one can verify any of this.
Exactly. It's like when I used to work with Chris Dundee. I was his right-hand man. I ran the convention hall. You can ask anyone. You can ask anyone that's not living anymore. Yeah, it's outrageous. You know what this is? This is a clear case of wrestling imposter syndrome, also known as Pauli's disease. And on a much smaller scale, every town has this guy who may or may not have been in or around the wrestling business, but knows just enough to convince restaurant owners and bar owners that they're somehow affiliated with this glorious world of professional wrestling. And they'll walk into Luigi's Pizza and go, hey, I'm a wrestler. I'm on TV with Dusty Rhodes. Oh, yeah, I used to know those guys, all those guys. They sign an 8x10. They have a belt that they made for themselves that they parade around in. And every town has this guy because wrestling is the only business that if you look freaky enough, the people won't know the difference. It's kind of feasible to them. So they're like, okay, not that we even care, but okay, you're a wrestler. Good for you.
Well, plus he's saying he was the masked Hangman. He's saying he wore a mask. So how do you, unless you know your stuff, how do you disprove? Because who's going to go?
Well, that's genius, exactly.
Yeah, why would this guy lie to me about this? But that's all he's doing is lying about it.
Right. It's genius. I wore a mask. How glorious to wear a mask in real life. Like, I didn't cheat on you. The guy had a mask on.
Back to the honorees of the CAC. Nominations are in, and I've been informed that April 2005 for the 40th reunion, I have been awarded the honor to stand before my peers and be honored for my years of achievements. I will join the ranks of such greats as James Cagney, Mickey Rooney, Lou Thez, The Destroyer, Stu Hart, Kurt Angle, Mike Mazurki, Killer Kowalski, Jimmy Valiant, Mad Dog Vachon, and so many more. I hope I'm still alive many years later to cherish this touching moment. By the way, this touching moment that never happened.
Right. Oh, my God.
Was James Cagney and Mickey Rooney honored by the CAC?
I think in the olden days they totally were. I do believe so.
Like when it was not a reunion like it is now, when it was just
it was it was Hollywood. I think it was a way smaller. I think it was a way smaller affair. They used to have legit huge Hollywood stars like George Raft and people like that, and the boxing wrestling connection with the Olympic and all that, and they were all intertwined in those days. The entertainment, the mob, the Olympic. So those LA guys, Vandal and Bob Barnett, are so lucky. And Dan, hey, Dan, get well. I see you sitting there in the hospital all during the holidays. Feel well, Dan Farron. Come on, man.
Well, hopefully by the time the show is released, he actually will be out of the hospital and doing well. But yeah, absolutely. Dan, feel better. We're all thinking about you right now. And you can't prove Lano right. He's been calling you the late Dan Farron for years. You can't prove him right. Dan and Superstar Graham, reports of their death are severely overrated. Hey, listen to this one. In pro wrestling, as in life, sometimes you are the babyface, and sometimes you are the heel. A man I used to know, a singer named Ricky Nelson, released a song that became a major hit. That song was called Garden Party. Ironically, much of what is in that song pertains to things in this book. You see, Ricky Nelson tried to make his comeback at Madison Square Garden. And MSG was where I did my last show before my stroke and was the beginning to my long road back. In the song, he uses the saying, "You can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself." And I think that's exactly what this book is. It's the Hangman pleasing himself. Close to 300 pages. And again, that may sound like a daunting read. Literally, it's 2 paragraphs per page. I've never seen less. Yeah, it's like a children's book. Yeah. A singer I used to know, Ricky Nelson. Another guy who's dead and can't verify any of this. Incredible. Poor Johnny Cash gets his name besmirched. I first met Terry. Still my Hulk Hogan here. I first met Terry in a club on Sunset Beach in Florida. He was playing in a band. I used to make some guest appearances in this club and get on stage and sing. So I was well known there. That was my first dealings with the future superstar, the one and only Hulk Hogan. Mm-hmm. Again, this is another fantastic part of the story we didn't know before. Not only did he know Hogan before he was in wrestling, he used to get up on stage and sing with him. Right. He was so well known in this club, in Sunset Beach. Right. So now he's known in Texas, he's known in Tampa. He worked with Andre earlier in his career. So 1970 tops. Then you got Hogan, like 1974, singing in the bars, tops. Well, the other interesting thing is he slammed Andre. And again, the timeline of the book is all over the place because I think he says Dick Bruiser discovers him in like the mid-70s. So that throws things off. But let's just say hypothetically it's true. Let's just say the Hangman body slammed Andre the Giant and pinned him, let's say 75, right? Right. I would assume a younger man in good shape. Years later, here's what he says. There was one time we were trying to teach the students how to do a body slam. One of the students was James, a little man in size, but big in heart. We mentioned that anyone can learn to give anyone a body slam. The class joked that the little show, I guess that's his name, the guy, could not do body slams. Yokozuna and I decided to prove our point by me, the Hangman, picking up and body slamming the over 800-pound Yokozuna. Oh, right. The class was floored by what they saw until we did it again. And this time took it slow and explained how each other helped in this feat. Later that day, the little show body slammed me. This was one day in class that all had a memorable experience. Have you ever... Brian, have you ever been next to Yokozuna? Yes, actually. And he's the size of a fucking banquet table. He was the size of an elephant, not a baby elephant. He was the biggest person I've ever been next to. Forget it. Well, he not only slammed him, but he slammed him a second time slowly to show. Exactly, to show the real technique. I mean, Jesus Christ, if you had a crane, you couldn't body slam Yokozuna. Jesus Christ. I don't know how Yokozuna got around, by the way. I had sushi with him one night, the night when Samu set my friend's napkin on fire. Yokozuna was so tremendous
this is honest, at the time I thought, how does he even get dressed, much less work? Because just his outfit, I envisioned each part of it coming on, and I'm like, okay, you got the underneath tights, and he's just gigantic, and I'm like, then he has to pull on those Oriental-style tights. I know Oriental is a taboo word, but I think it applies here. You know, like all the Japanese wrestlers wear the tights that end at the knee. I don't know how that became a Japanese wrestling trademark. Little Tokyo has to wear it. Mr. Saito always wore it. They cut off at the knee, Japanese style. Anyway, and I'm envisioning it like, oh, he has to pull on those tights, the poor guy. I can't really tell you people, he was humongous. Was he not the biggest person you ever saw up close, fat-wise?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's before he was at his biggest, by the way. I'm talking like 1994.
That's when I hung out with him, yeah. Like 90, I probably like 92, 93, maybe early 90s for sure. And yeah, I just couldn't believe how he got around. Oh, but he got around when Fat Mel threw up. Oh, he jumped up then. He was across the room like a mouse. He was agile. I had to give him that because I was stuck. I was frozen like in a graphic novel, like, holy shit, my worlds are colliding. Samu H-bombs my friend Fat Mel. Fat Mel starts throwing up in the sushi place, and I'm looking at it in slow motion. And Yokozuna and Tatanka and Crush were across the room by the bathroom, just horrified, scarred for life. So, I mean, he moved when he had to, apparently. He was quicker than me.
Well, here's another passage from the book, Howard, and we'll wrap this up pretty soon. Recently, December 2002, I answered the call and accepted a role as a Christian evangelist. October 2002, I answered an altar call at the First African Missionary Baptist Church in Kingsland, Georgia. My wife answered the call, and while she was standing there, a few minutes later, I agreed to join her and answer the call. My wife's sister and her husband used to belong to this same church. They are still involved here, but now he received a calling to help lead another flock. Let me fast forward a little bit. 2 months later, I was watching two of my friends on TV. They are Ted DiBiase and Nikita Koloff. They are both in the wrestling business like me, and they are now Christian evangelists. Two friends of his that he saw on TV, and he decided to adopt their story. I mean, he decided to talk about it here.
I like how he left Superstar and Jake out of it, at least.
Well, hold on. There's a list of other wrestlers here. Let's see.
Oh, I did see that. Yeah.
$1 Million Man DiBiase, Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, The Road Warriors, George Animal Steel, Sting, Nikita Koloff, Superstar Billy Graham, Terry Taylor, Jesse Hernandez, and Greg the Hammer Valentine, just to name a few. Is Greg the Hammer Valentine religious?
Well, personally, in my relationship with Christ, he's one of the first people that I think of when I'm so inclined. I don't know. I had never heard that he was one of those guys. Now,
this book is amazing. And by the way, according to this, I believe he's saying it's 1974 that Dick the Bruiser discovered him.
Yeah, he's all over the place. He's discovered before he body slammed Andre the Giant.
You know what's disappointing? Like, if you're going to make up a story, you could be a lot more creative with it. You know what I mean? Like, it's like I said, it's general stories he's taken and applied to himself.
Right.
Oh, we were so poor on the road, we had to sleep in the car. And
Oh, we had a thing called the bologna blowout.
Because when we were on the road, we had bologna, only enough money for a loaf of bread and bologna.
Right. You know what's hilarious? I actually overheard somebody saying that to his girlfriend at the CAC as they were going into the actual bologna blowout. And he said exactly what you just said to her. He goes, they call it this because in the old days we used to have just a loaf of bread and some bologna and a case of beer. So you want to guess who that might be?
Who?
It's David. There's no build up to that. Sorry. That was Cuban Assassin, David Sierra. He was explaining that to his woman as we walked into the bologna banquet.
Now, he didn't break into the business until the 80s, right? Or was he wrestling in the 70s?
Probably broke in 80-ish because he was on Mid-Atlantic TV by 82 as a Giazobber.
And I like how also whenever he talks about any of these guys that passed away, he throws in his expression, bless you, Dick the Bruiser. You talk a lot about this business, and every time I step in the ring, I think of you and the heartfelt love you had for this business and the wrestling fans all over the world. Hang in there, brother.
Right.
Someday
By the way, I love his fucking catchphrase, "Hang in there, brother," because I can't not imagine it in the voice of the hormone monster from Big Mouth. Hang in there, brother. What you gonna do, baby? Hang in there, brother. Totally.
What do you think? What do you think of the idea? Let's take Bruce Pobands out of the equation, of a masked heel Hangman, and his catchphrase is "Hang in there."
Right. Well, he's an inspirational heel. You know, that's a subgenre that's not explored as often. The inspirational heel. Hang in there, baby.
There's a whole photo section here. The photo section has to be seen to be believed, because it's just, there are no photos of him during this illustrious career. There are photos of him, like in 2003, being inducted into the Boogie Wrestling, I think it's BWC. It's whatever it is, Jimmy Valiant's Hall of Fame. I believe for the guys he trained.
They're very selective, I understand.
There's a whole section here about Cactus Jack being his friend. I question this.
I love how everything revolves around his stroke. It's like, congratulations on your stroke, man. Hang in there. It's like every person, like Ole Anderson's like, happy stroke.
Do you think he like came to after his stroke and like his family just wanting to like make him happy? Like, yes, you were a wrestler. You body slammed Andre the Giant.
How funny would that be? Oh my God, that's the movie right there.
Your stroke was at Madison Square Garden.
That's the movie right there. That's $1 million idea.
I wonder if we could improve upon this, like the Hangman story. If we could take some of the loose principles.
I don't see how you could fail to improve upon it.
And we take these loose principles.
I don't think you could make it any worse.
Special salute, Dick the Bruiser, the man who introduced me to the world of pro wrestling. Rest in peace, my friend. Hang in there. He's dead. Can't hang in there. Should have said that before he died. This book is something else. And again, it's 304 pages. Almost nothing on these pages.
Incredible.
We got to find out, did he actually print this book up and give it to people? Or sell it?
You know, I remember him having booths at various CACs that I attended, and seems to me that the book was real, that it was, there's actual copies of it. You know, my memory is not to be trusted, but kind of seems to me he had these 8x10s, and I believe he had his book, which is so ironic because you have all these guys, all these journeymen throughout wrestling who could have done a great version of that book, and here's this guy who is nothing who wrote the book.
What do you think of the balls of showing up? Like, it's one thing to do this in high,
right?
But it's another thing to do this and then show up at CAC until they ask you not to come back.
Right. That would be like me. That would be like me going to NAMM as, you know, like Josh Winger or somebody. Hey, man, it's me. That's crazy. I mean, where do you get the? But you know, at the time, the standard for the CAC was weird because Paul Lee struts around there like a world champion. I mean, it's odd.
But hold on, he struts around there like Nature Boy Paul Lee. Like, whatever we want to say about him, at least he is who he. Like, it's not like he's someone who's never wrestled.
Right.
He has been Nature Boy Paul Lee for good or for bad for a long period of time. But they're the Super Tramps. They're the Hangman Bruce Pobands. I remember Jeff Walton talked about it. I think him and Victor Rivera were at some reunion at Vern Langdon's place years ago when they met the fake Bull Ramos. Like, think of the balls.
No way.
Think of the balls of showing up at a wrestler's reunion and pretending.
Oh, my God. I remember that now. Yeah. Oh, my God. Yeah, that's balls. Exactly.
Well,
exactly.
There it is.
Well, there's a lot of pretenders out there.
The long, elusive book, Hang in There. The story of the Hangman Bruce Pobands. Hopefully book 2 will be out. I'd like to know what happened in between all of these moments, between the Andre match and the Yokozuna body slam. What else happened? Because there's a lot of holes.
So many historic moments, you know. The book is only so big if you're going to self-publish.
Where's the Ric Flair chapter?
Right. Oh, I worked with Rick. He was a great champion.
A lot of people think he was great. He was great night after night. He was also a party animal. Like, it's every general thought. Dusty had a big ego. He never wanted to put me over.
Jimmy Valiant was surprisingly very quiet in real life. You'd be amazed at the 90-degree transformation in personality from the wild man he portrayed on screen.
I would show up at the studios at TBS, and the red light would go on the camera, and I knew it was time. I had to go out there and deliver a promo.
Right. Like never.
Gordon Solie, the dean of pro wrestling, the man who talked me back into wrestling after my stroke.
Right.
How did he
Thank
do
you,
that?
Gordon.
By the way, Gordon was losing his voice in 1998.
Yeah.
When was the stroke?
That's a good question. Such a critical part of his story, of his hero's journey.
There's a lot of questions. Well, Howard, we're about to move on with the show. Anything you want to plug, anything you want to say to the listeners here before we move on?
Hey, guys, I wouldn't even be making this announcement because I've made premature announcements before and I've made a fool of myself. Well, here it is. WrestleMania season in April. Howard Baum and Hardway Art are going to be representing all over the Tampa scene, and we are going to also make our presence known at the CAC. Things are finally happened to the point that they're going to be available to the public in a timely and very cool manner. So I urge you to check out Hardway Art on the Facebook right now. Website will be here by WrestleMania. Before you know it, blink of an eye. So you can also friend me on Facebook, Howard Baum, B-A-U-M. Check me out on the Twitter. And, of course, Tuesday through Thursday nights, I am fully nude on the Chatterbait. So, in all sincerity, thank you again. Thank you, Brian, for giving me this platform and a whole new, life in wrestling. And all you guys out there, all my CAC friends that I party with personally one-on-one, all my 605 people who, at the very least, tolerate me. Thank you all, and all my co-hosts on the 605, Scott and all you guys. So just thank you, everybody. I've had a very lovely holiday season, and I hope that you guys did too, and a happy and wealthy 2020.
Hang in there, Howard. Well, Howard, while you're hanging in there, we don't want to keep the listeners hanging too much longer, so let's get going with the rest of the show. But first, a word about our friends, the wrestling fans over at Ramsor Records, and let's hear some music. How about that? That sets the tone. Nice and relaxing. I really love the sound of this. What you are hearing is someone we've talked about in the past here on the show. You may remember the album Run, Skeleton Run by David Childers. Well, this is his newest album, Interstate Lullaby. You're hearing the song Flow on River. And what a great sound this is. Of course, everything that comes out of Ramsor Records isn't just filled with great artists, but great sounds. So much attention is paid to making sure that the sound is great. And this is another winner from Ramsor Records. You can get a copy today of David Childers' new album, Interstate Lullaby, by going to ramsorrecords.kungfustore.com. Once again, ramsorrecords.kungfustore.com. R-A-M-S-E-U-R, Ramsor Records. Of course, the Mid-Atlantic wrestling of the music industry. It's going to be really hard to keep going with this show and not just continue listening to this, because I like this, and if you think this is good, you should really hear the rest of the album. David Childers, Interstate Lullaby. It is endorsed by the Superpodcast. Check it out today. But with that, I'm going to keep playing this as I do the introduction. Let's go to our next segment. We had a chance to speak with Roger Smith. You may remember him as Dirty Rhodes or The Assassin, many different names. And of course, he was a tag team partner with Randy Colley, who just recently passed away. Moondog Rex, Detroit Demolition, one of the Assassins as well. So many gimmicks, so many great moments in the wrestling business, and we're going to spend a few minutes talking about them with his former partner, Roger Smith. Let's go to this right now.
Never did leave, now it's 30 years gone.
I am happy today to welcome back to the Superpodcast Roger Smith, a man you may know as many different names, including Dirty Rhodes, but today specifically we're going to talk about his life and career as an assassin and one of his associates as an assassin. This sounds really devious as we say it here at the beginning, but Roger, thanks for being here again today.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Brian. Glad to be here. I can help out. Tell you little stories about Randy.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about Randy Colley. A lot of people know him as Moondog Rex. A lot of people may know him as the Nightmare or the Champion, Detroit Demolition, but really the first thing that put him on the map was being one of the assassins. And I know that he teamed up with Jody Hamilton for a brief period of time, as you did as well. And then, of course, you guys got together. When did you first meet Randy?
I think it was in 1974 or early 75. Met him in Pensacola. He was in Pensacola, and he was working down there as Jack Dalton or something like that, and they were doing the look-alike. They had Rip Tyler there. He was doing a Rip Tyler look-alike, and I went down there and worked a week or two, and I'd met him there, and he just broke into business, and he was the champion of everything and everybody. And he was living out there, and met him out there. It was on the end of the beach out there. He was in his car there where he slept there a little bit, and he just had broke into business. Wasn't making a whole lot of money, and I told him, you need to give them some of them trophies back to get with it. You know what I mean? But anyway, that's the first time I ever met him. But the second time I met, this is real interesting. I'm gonna go ahead and go with this thing. The second time I met Randy was, I was in Ron Fuller's territory. Don Carson and I were a team there, and Ron Fuller had bought the Pensacola territory, and a crew of us were going to go down to Pensacola. I was working as an assassin with Don Carson. They brought Randy in and did an underneath job, and Ron Fuller talked to me about working with him. He said, can you work with this young man? I said, well, yeah, we can. So Randy went on back, and I went ahead and finished out there. Then the whole crew moved to Pensacola, and Randy and I became a team with Billy Spears as manager. And how Randy and I became really, really close friends. When Jody and I worked as the assassin team in Atlanta, Randy was working as an electrician in Phoenix City, Alabama. So Wednesday nights we'd run Columbus, Georgia, and Randy would come and buy a ringside seat to watch us. And he was telling me that story, and, we joked around. I said, well, you thought you could whoop me. That's why you got in the business. And we had a big laugh about that. But he was really, Randy was great. I ended up meeting his whole family, and we can go into that, but a little bit more about Randy. We become partners, and we pioneered that territory. We had to resettle that thing, and it was tough and it was crazy, but it was real good and funny. When David Schultz and Don Carson and myself and that whole Knoxville crew there, I'll tell you a real funny story about him and David. We lived apartments apart a block or so, and I went up to their apartment one morning, and Don Carson and I was there, and we'd all working out. They were. Well, here come David and Randy. And Randy was jogging around the apartments, and David Schultz was running circles around him. We were laughing and carrying on. But anyway, finally we stopped and had talking. I said, well, David, you wasn't getting a good workout. Randy said, well, I can outrun him anyway. David said, you can't outrun me. Well, to make a long story short, they lined up, and Randy smoked him in a 50-yard dash. That big old fat boy could run, man. I mean, but, and later on, we were both into Knoxville. When we went to Jerry's territory, we went as assassins, and we were only there for a little bit. And he left and went ahead and teamed up and became the Moondogs. And he came back to Nashville there, and I lived right outside of Nashville. We spent a lot of time together. Donnie and I were working, and Randy and Larry were working as the Moondogs, and we were working as assassins. But
let me take a step back, because you brought up Pensacola. You were there when the Fields brothers still owned it, and then you were there when Ron Fuller decided to open a southern end to his territory. He had Knoxville, and then he had Pensacola. What was it like? What was the differences between Pensacola under the Fields brothers and Pensacola under Ron Fuller?
Ooh, a lot of difference. I mean, when I was there, let me be fair with the Fields brothers. It was the latter part. I mean, I don't know, the territory wasn't really doing that well, with the guys who were older and stuff like that, and hadn't really hit the cycle. So when Ron went down there, like I said, we had to pioneer that sucker. We had to fight every night. The marks, I mean, it was crazy. I mean, we had so much heat. We had riots. I mean, it was just nuts. And the buildings filled up, and we were drawing money. It was crazy. Randy and I we did a deal one night with Billy Spears, and they got him hurt, and we was trying to get him out of the building there in Dothan, Alabama, in that big old farm center. And they had us trapped in with cars, and had a car block. It had one of those deals where you had to have a key to undo the lock and the wheels and stuff. Randy just reached in and jerked that sucker out of gear and rolled it down out of the way, and we just took right on out of the place, But we had to fight all the time down there. A really good story is the police, they were on our side because they had a bunch of thugs, really, is what the fans were. Some of them were. But a boy jumped there one night on Billy Spears, and he broke down in a karate stance, and Billy broke down into a karate stance. Well, man, the crowd erupted, and I told Randy, oh, God, he's going to get killed. So Randy bailed out of the ring, and when Randy bailed out of the ring, the guy ran, and he sashayed under the ropes. They had a rope around the ring, and he sashayed under that rope. When he did, he started to turn around. In the meantime, I pitched Randy the tag belt, and when that guy turned around, Randy baseballed him with that bat. Whop! And the cops come to us and told him, man, it took 5 or 6 carlos to get him every time. We just call you next time to go get him. It was tough, man, but, the territory was on fire.
Well, let's talk about the gimmick. Let's talk about being an assassin. Both of you teamed up with Jody Hamilton, who many people consider the assassin. Him and Tom Ernesto started as the assassins, and then Tom retired, and Jody kept on with the gimmick, having different tag team partners at different times. Did Jody ever have an issue with you guys being the assassins without him?
Not that I know of. No, nothing. Jody's never said nothing to me about it. See, Jody worked after Jody and I were partners. I was there when the split came, right there with the Gunkel deal, and Tom had put me over in a lot of matches, to get me over with Jody. And we drew super big. People lined up around the buildings down the streets to get in to see Jody and I. So,
How much heat did the assassins have in Georgia?
Oh shit! They'd throw bottles at me, man. I'd drive into the back of the old auditorium, and I had to jump out of my car, and they'd have to get around me. The police would, and they'd throw everything they could at me. Tom Ernesto had me on fire. When I split the team, so to speak, down there, we did a deal, and they called me the enforcer. And I sort of like I split the team. Let me give a dog arrow. Tom did a series of matches with me. We'd do boxing matches. We'd do all kind of things, and he'd put me over. You know what I mean? And it was just super hot. Rock Hunter was the manager, and it was hot. Yeah. So
you guys are the assassins working for Ron Fuller. How did you get into Memphis? How did you get into Jarrett's company?
I left Ron Fuller's territory and went to Bill Watts' territory with Jody. And I got, during Christmas over, I got my knee hurt and got my nose broke. And I went home back to my family after Christmas, and I never did go back to the territory in Louisiana. And that's from there I came back into Knoxville, and that's when me and Randy went in there again. At that period of time. It was right between, from the time we went to down there, and Randy and I had separated in Dothan, and I went to Louisiana, and I don't know where Randy went from there. I think he hung around there with Don Carson and Billy Spears and those guys. And then I came from my parents' house and I can't remember exactly what happened. Randy and I got together, and I met Randy at his home in Alexander City, Alabama. And we went to his family and my family. We went to Memphis together.
How did you like Memphis for that run?
It was shaky that first run. I wasn't there but a couple of weeks, and we couldn't get the money right, to be honest. But after that, I stayed there 10, 12 years. I had a house and everything out there. I had a farm, and I bought property and stuff. But yeah, I loved the Memphis territory.
Do you remember when Randy got the call to get his opportunity in the World Wrestling Federation?
Yes, I do. He just went and done it. I remember when not so much as when he got that call to go there, but I knew that because through the grapevine. But after that, he had moved back to, like I said, when he come back into the territory, him and Larry as the Moondogs, and Donnie and I were there as the Assassins. And that's when Randy had developed. He come to my house, and I had a house in Westmoreland, and he came to my house. That's when he was developing that Axe and Smash gimmick. And we were working on the gimmick, the outfit, because my wife does that kind of stuff, and we were developed right there in that house. So,
well, that ended up being part of a lawsuit with him and
Randy filed a lawsuit. He did that, man. I watched it. So help me if I never get up out of my seat. I watched the boy develop that in my house. We were talking about how he had that belt and that cross stuff and all that gimmick that they put on that. We was laughing. Me and my wife were laughing, but it was a good gimmick.
Yeah.
To be honest, we thought it was burlesque, We thought, hey, man, that's a good deal, He needs a necktie or a bow tie, you know what I mean? But, no, it was a good gimmick, and they actually ripped him off for it.
Yeah.
You know how it works.
Yeah, and I believe there was a lawsuit later on with him and Bill Eadie claiming they owned the gimmick, and Vince McMahon claimed he developed and owned the gimmick, and everyone seems to agree the fact that Vince McMahon did not create the gimmick. Vince McMahon just inherited the gimmick from the guys that worked for him.
Man, so help me. Hey, I was in Pakistan with Bill years ago, but anyway, that's another story. But him and Randy did that because Randy came to Nashville to my home, and he was scouting out the stuff and everything, and that's how it all started. I mean, so help me it was. But man, he was a super guy. His family was a super family. We'd go fishing. We'd go up. His family had a big barge out on the lake up there at the lake there. We'd go up and spend the night out and crappie fish all night. Me and him, and my wife, and we had a blast, man. Randy's good people.
What can you tell me about Randy in the ring? What was it about him that stood out? What was it about him that people maybe that if they aren't in the ring they wouldn't notice that made him so good?
I don't know. He was just dedicated. You know, he was just dedicated. I mean, he worked hard on his body. He worked hard on everything. He wanted to input. Man, he was great at input. Randy he had booking skills. You know what I mean? He learned the business from bottom up. He didn't leave nothing out. And I've heard statements and stuff from him, and it was true because I know him personally. He would have done it over 10,000 times, and he didn't understand why nobody wouldn't have been able to be a wrestler. You know what I mean? It was just the greatest thing. I could still see him, man. I know I'm getting flight of ideals. I could still see him standing and grilling in his trunks and just declaring it was the best thing in his whole life. You know what I mean? And this man was a certified electrician, master electrician, all that. You know what I mean? But he loved wrestling, man. That's the thing that didn't stand. I mean, the drive in him made him good.
Did he enjoy being a moondog?
Man, as far as I know, he never did. Yeah, he loved it. Yeah, God, they loved that gimmick. Him and Larry, they were good buddies too. You know, him and Larry. When they come in that territory, it'd be me and Larry and him, and we had a big van. We all drove together. We were just like brothers. I mean, gosh, Randy's a special guy, man. He was a go-getter. He didn't he wouldn't take no for an answer. You know what I mean? He just easy to work with, easy to learn, and you know, to be fair to Randy, when I was a little more experienced when Randy got as a team with me, and it took a little bit to get him to tone in to see what was actually going on. But man, it just clicked. You know, it just. You know how young guys sometimes are herky-jerky, miss a spot, or step up here or step over there a little bit late. Yeah. But once the flow started, oh my gracious, it was like just a flower blooming all of a sudden. You know what I mean? And the tag team stuff, we worked great. I mean, probably the tag team. Me and Randy had more stuff down than any other. Me and Donnie or me and Jody. Me and Randy had more spots and stuff. I mean, that we could pull off and do and I can't say it about Jody or Randy. I mean, Jody was the master of that stuff. You know what I mean?
Did you stay in touch with Randy after you guys both retired? And when did you hear the news, and how did you hear the news of his passing?
Well, I stayed in touch, and I lost in touch with him there for about 5 to 6 years, something like that. And I saw him at Scott Teal's at a reunion, and he didn't seem like he was altogether good then. And I lost touch with him again, and then his first wife informed me. She texted me and said that he was in the nursing home and wasn't doing good, and that's how it all started. And it just didn't take 2 weeks, and he was gone. So,
Roger, we appreciate you giving us a few minutes today. In closing, how will you best remember Randy Colley?
Oh, Jesus, I don't know, man. You put tears in my eyes now. Oh, Lord. A friend. Man, I don't know, man. I can't. It's hard. There's so many things I could say, but really one of a kind. Special one of a kind person. I'm like, can I do it all over again with it? You know what I mean?
There it is, a friend of the show, Roger Smith, paying tribute to his friend, Randy Colley, his friend and his partner. And we're really happy that we were able to spend a few minutes speaking with Roger here this week on the show. And, of course, on the topic of wrestlers who just recently passed away, Izzy Slapowitz, a name that fans of ICW may remember. He was there for a long time, the manager of the Devil's Duo. He was also a wrestler, not just a manager. And we wanted to spend a few minutes talking about him and his career. And who better to do that with than the Hustler, Rip Rogers, a friend of the show, back here this week. He's going to talk about Izzy and where he was with him, working for the Culkins, working for ICW. There's always wrestling history mixed in with these segments, and you're going to hear a lot here about Izzy Slapowitz and ICW. Let's go to this segment right now. I am very happy to welcome back to the Superpodcast today, Rip Rogers, and we're going to talk a little bit about someone who he worked with in ICW, the late Izzy Slapowitz, who of course just passed away, Jeff Smith. But Rip, thanks for being back on the show here today.
It's your pleasure, I'm sure.
Well, it certainly is, and I'm sure it'll be the listeners' pleasure as well. Let's talk a little bit about Izzy Slapowitz. Do you remember when you first met him?
Let's see. I went down, it was right after New Year's in 1979. Angelo Poffo, the miser, Randy's daddy, I had left Nashville, and he talked to Frankie Kane, who was the great Mephisto, who was the booker in the Mississippi territory that the Culkins ran. And so every week we ran Jackson, Greenville, Greenwood, Gulfport, and Vicksburg every week. So you had to know how to wrestle. Now, when I was there, let's see, I'd gotten their number from the Freebirds who come to work over to Nashville, and they were teenagers. And they said I'd do good over there and get to work every day. So Angelo called him up, and then Frankie Kane, he's the guy that gave me the name Rip Rogers, because Eddie Graham was the original Rip Rogers in Texas in 1955. And he said I reminded him of Eddie Graham. So I said, oh, hell, that's good. So I had 4 names in my career, and the last one was Rip Rogers. So I've been Rip Rogers since 1979. So what the hell, right? And when I got there, I met Izzy Slapowitz. Izzy had worked for Frankie Kane when he was the booker for Leroy McGurk in the Oklahoma territory before Watts had it. So it was me, Izzy, Ralph Derryberry, who was Big Boy Williams, and Shooter Rick Connors. We all lived in the motel in Jackson, Tennessee. So Izzy was one of my roommates. So he was from Brooklyn, and so he had that, he was the world's biggest wrestling fan, and he had that funny accent. He could talk with this and that. So Izzy was my manager there. And then a couple of years later, he come in to work in ICW. So he was my manager there for a while in ICW too. So me and Izzy got some history. And the last time I saw him, I did a wrestling seminar in New York City for Mike Mondo, who was one of the Spirit Squad. And all of a sudden I hear him call me a redneck pencil neck schlemiel or whatever. And we started laughing. And then, so I had our bullshit session with him, telling stories, talking about this and that in New York City. And that was the last time I actually, pretty much I talked to him a long time there.
What was it like in 1979 in Mississippi? Because obviously the Culkins had been local promoters for Leroy McGurk and Bill Watts, and then they broke off and ran opposition. Was the company doing well? What was it like running against at that time, I think it was still the NWA office, because Bill Watts had not fully broken off from Leroy yet and run away with Louisiana and Mississippi.
Well, George was he was then politically strong. So we ran Greenville every week, Greenwood every week. Gulfport, which is right outside Biloxi, Vicksburg, Jackson. And it was, my gosh, you go out there and they were rabid wrestling fans. It was a great place to learn, and a lot of veterans were there. Kamala was there. When he was there, he was Ugly Bear Harris. And then he turned babyface and he became Sugar Bear Harris. But he had to turn because Percy Pringle was his manager, and he'd beating him on TV. And his wife was going to beat him up and everything, so he had to turn babyface. I remember Kamala won a battle royal, and he supposedly won $2,000. His wife was wanting to go out and buy new tires on the truck. And anyway, so he actually slept over on our floor a couple times. So he didn't want. He was too scared to go home or whatever. But he was just a really, really nice guy. And then a couple of years, then it was like 1983, and there he was as Kamala for Bill Watts and and that's the way the story goes. So it was Ralph, me, Izzy, Rick Connors, all living in Jackson together. So you can imagine the shit that went along there.
Was he already Izzy Slapowitz? Had he already developed the name? And did he ever tell you where the name came from?
Yeah, he was Izzy Slapowitz. Now, when he worked for Frankie in Leroy's old territory in Oklahoma, he was Ilya Zimovich. It wasn't quite as bad. But then all of a sudden he became Izzy Slapowitz in Mississippi. And then when he worked for us in ICW, he was Izzy Slapowitz because he was working for Garvin and them in Knoxville when they broke off from Ron Fuller. And he come in and Big Boy worked. He come in too and he worked. So that was how. So I was with Izzy in ICW, and then he was working for All Star, and then they sort of come into ICW and joined us. So we were all the outlaws there. So that's how Izzy got in, and that's how I stayed connected with Izzy.
You lived with him for a while in Mississippi. Did you ever get his backstory? How did he break into the business? How was he trained?
He just told me he was the world's biggest fan, and he used to go to Sunnyside Garden in New York. And the guys would know him because he was the most obnoxious fan, and he had that accent. And he was one of the guys that loved the heels, and people didn't do that then. But he just loved all the heels, and that was how he got into wrestling business. So a lot of unique stories there.
So let's fast forward a little bit. ICW, of course, like you said, he worked for All Star against Ron Fuller, and that's really where the Bob Roop camp and the Poffo camp came together. Once he comes up to ICW, did he fit in right away?
Well, hell, we were all a bunch of misfits. So we weren't there to judge anybody. We was happy and lucky to have anybody that would work for us because of the threatening of being blackballed, which was at that time was a pretty good, you were sort of scared of, but hell, if you couldn't get a job anyway, what the hell, right? What do you thought? When we were with ICW, we ran against Ron Fuller. We ran against Dick the Bruiser. We ran against Vern Gagne. We ran against Jerry Jarrett. We ran against Nick Goulas. We ran against Jim Barnett. We didn't give a shit who you were. We ran against everybody. So, and Bob Geigel too. So it was funnier than hell. And pretty much ended up working for everybody else too. So if you could, that's like Roop and Orton. They went off and they left ICW because now all of a sudden what they did was they thought they should have been making more money, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Then you get in the wrestling business and you see that, oh, there's all these expenses. I remember this is like 1979. We had to draw $13,000 a week to break even for minimal payroll, TV bills, and stuff like that. So all of a sudden, when you're just one of the boys, you don't know that shit. But when you're in the office, you're paying for posters, you're paying for insurance, you're paying for van upkeep, ring stuff, insurance, ring repair, et cetera, stuff like that. You need to have the money to pay for the poster, everything up front. So when we was ICW, we all took money and threw it in and had $100,000 kitty like. And then Angelo said, okay, if we have to dip into it or something, all he wanted to do was wrestle and have where he could work with his kids too. So we threw that money in there. So he had $100,000 working capital to work with. But when you said, oh, we should have got this, whatever, blah, 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 we hardly made any money. We ran Rupp Arena in Lexington where Jarrett's run, and you draw $10,000 in. That's a lot of money. You're looking at a $3, $4, and $5 ticket price, and we barely made enough money because of expenses. And then after a couple of years, you see that as a promoter, the promoters wanted to take, hell, the boys got it made. Hell, the boys made more money than I did as an owner. But all I did was sit there and shut up and just wanted to wrestle and learn the business.
If you needed to make $13,000 a week to break even, how many weeks did you actually break even?
Well, a lot of weeks we didn't break even. So the miser kept dipping into the till. He kept paying for everything. So then he bought two $33,000 diesel vans, Iveco diesel vans, one for Babyface and one for the heel, so we wouldn't burn our cars up. And then he bought a $33,000 ring truck. And this is like 1980, so that's a lot of money to pull out. And they say, well, he was so tight. Well, the reason he was tight, he was born during the Depression, and he didn't have running water and electricity. And he was an only child, so he was determined not to be poor. So he saved all his money. And Izzy was a part of all of that.
Well, in terms of Izzy, I think people probably best remember him in ICW for being the manager of the Devil's Duo. Do you remember how that was put together?
Well, it was now Angelo Poffo. He was the original Devil's Duo with him and Chris Markoff working for Dick the Bruiser, and Bobby Heenan was their manager. And that's when Angelo was, now he was a part-time wrestler and worked for Gagne and worked for Bruiser part-time. All the time, the boys, Randy and Lanny, were in school until Lanny graduated, and then he went back on the road again. So here he was in Downers Grove, Illinois, as a PE teacher with bleached blonde hair. But that was the original Devil's Duo. And then we got Jeff Sword out of the ICW Wrestling School, which is a story in itself. And then Doug Vines was trained, I think, by Tojo with Nick Goulas. And then when he was a young boy, and they put them together, and Izzy was a mouthpiece, and they will learn to work every day. And you pick it up and you learn how to do it. You know how to do stuff that's safe. You know how to work. You can pull time with anybody, and you become good. And they were young boys in their 20s working with the older guys, and they learned. And once you learn it, you got that son of a bitch down. But Izzy was a big part of that. Izzy was one of the best promo guys. Izzy drew some tremendous heat. We had some riots and stuff, and Izzy was a big part of having those riots. It was awesome.
I want to take a little bit of a sidestep real quick. You mentioned the ICW Wrestling School. Who ran the ICW Wrestling School? What was the story with that?
For a while, we were buying a building in downtown Lexington. And me and Randy actually lived in the building, and Buddy Landell did too. And then we were going to have to pay $50,000 just to fix up the electrical. And Miser said, poop on that, we're not going to do it. So then we ran Rough Arena some and had to go to do a lot of political stuff to get in there because Jarrett lived in Hendersonville, and they run, Nashville, Evansville, Memphis, Louisville, and Lexington. And that was really their best town. So when Randy eventually worked with them, they drew 8,000 people to Rough Arena against Jerry Lawler. So we were over big. We was over big time. We did everything. We had guys you could beat the shit out of each other. We were young, we were hungry, we were athletic, but we had the shitty TVs and the inferior TVs, the UHF stations, and they would have the V's, which are stronger, and they had the solid TV slime slot. Like in Louisville, they'd be on channel 3 at noon. We'd be on channel 41 at maybe 1:30 in the afternoon. In Memphis, they was on live there for the 90-minute show. We had the tape show was on a different channel there. We was on channel 25 on Evansville late night, but they was on channel 7. In Lexington, they were on the stronger station, channel 18. When we started out on 62, but moved to channel 36 as it got a little power boost. But we all decided to stay in Lexington. Why? Randy always said he threw a dart and hit Lexington, and there we were. But the first TV we got was, we made our first TV tapings on March 13th, 1979, right there at Channel 41 in Louisville, Kentucky. And the first TV we had was Hazard. And that was one of Fuller's great towns. And we was on Channel 57 and in Hazard. And we ran Combs, which is a couple of miles outside, and we'd have turn-away business there. That Eastern Kentucky was a gold mine. One thing, they had Roop, Garvin, Orton, Malenko, et cetera. They were over so strong off the Knoxville TV So that Eastern Kentucky was a gold mine, and that kept us in business for years and years, just Eastern Kentucky. Because, we had TVs we ran Johnson City, Tennessee weekly. We had Oak Hill, West Virginia TV. We had the Hazard TV. We had the Lexington TV, the Louisville TV, the Evansville TV. We had the Memphis TV. We had a TV in Puerto Rico that paid us money. We had a TV in two of them in Montana that paid us money. One in Mobile, Pensacola that paid us money. And then we had 4 TVs in Southern Illinois, and it was the station where Dick the Bruiser was at in like Champaign, Urbana, way up there in, it'd be sort of like Northern Illinois. So we was competing against everybody and didn't give a shit. We were just running towns. But anyway, back to the ICW wrestling school.
Yeah.
It was George Lanny, Pez Watley, who was a babyface at the time.
George
And
Weingrove?
Garvin was there. Yes. And George was a wrestling coach at the Indiana School for the Blind. Him and Pez were teammates at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. George was like the 185-pounder, and then Pez was the heavyweight. And Pez was the first black state champion in Tennessee. And he became a powerlifting champion, etc. And we had about over 100 people there. They just come in for the first day and paid $25. Garvin went there, and he was against all of them because all they're a bunch of marks. So Garvin would get guys in the ring, and he'd sort of stretch them and sugar them, and guys would pee their pants, poop their pants, and whatever, and they spread Garvin was going to kill these guys. He didn't want them in the business, but a couple guys survived. Ron Strunk was one. Jeff Sword got in, and then but I don't think Jeff got. I think Jeff got a little before that. And then they teamed him up with Doug Vines, and they had is their manager. So I'm going back and forth, and I just start talking, jabbing as usual. So you cut me off, Brian, if I'm saying something stupid or going off there, because this main thing was just talking about Izzy.
No, that's quite all right, because we're getting an overall history lesson, and I think that's important. Talking about Izzy again, you mentioned that he started some riots, he had great heat. How much heat did he have being a Jewish character in the South during this period of time?
Well, I was so naive. So I didn't know, I didn't know what a Jewish character was. And I don't think anybody in Redneck Hillbilly Haven, where we were wrestling most of the time, that they knew what they were. Because you're looking at New York City and Jewish from big cities and stuff like that, and what he was portraying and everything. And we was wrestling mostly in Redneckville. So they hated everybody.
The heat that he generated in your eyes wasn't necessarily any sort of anti-Semitic thing as much as just him being a heel manager.
Right. It's like I was from Seymour, Indiana, population 12,000 or whatever. I didn't know what a Jew was. But you get mad at somebody, you call them a Jew because that's what somebody else said. The hell, I didn't even know what the hell that was. Didn't know anything at all about it.
Was it tough for him to be a manager, considering he was a trained wrestler? Was it tough for him not to be in the ring and just be at ringside?
I have no idea. I wasn't him. You know that when you're a manager, you're there to get them out of finishes. You're there to be a mouthpiece for somebody. They're here to use distractions, but do it so the referee is enforcing his job to do what he's supposed to be doing, and you're not bearing the ref. You're actually breaking rules, and the ref's being the good official, and he's catching you and making you sit down in that chair. In the meanwhile, the Devil's duo are switching behind the guy's back, and they're double teaming or whatever, because the referee's busy with the manager trying to keep the fiasco as legit contest, and then the fans would just go crazy at Izzy, throwing shit at him, hitting him, but that was the norm. I remember me and Randy would tag there. We'd leave the ring. We would have to sometimes punch our way out, walk out back to back to protect each other, and I remember Randy got stabbed. Hell, I got stabbed in South Africa, and that was just the way it was, and it was just normal. That's why guys don't get it when we'd actually have to fight our way back to the dressing room. We had fucking riots and stuff like that. I'll try not to cuss too much. And then, and now we got the wrestling where it's a joke and it's a rib. And the crowds were just so different. They'd be crying for their baby faces. They get violent, try to protect the good guys and everything. And now everything's a joke. Everybody's a snowflake. Everybody gets to do their stupid chants. And now there's that a Ricky Morton selling and the girls crying and shit. Now they're laughing. Oh, and they're in a rest hold. Anyway, I didn't want to get into that shit.
What was the story with Randy getting stabbed?
Oh, it was just part of it. It happened. Hell, all of a sudden, zoop, and then it's gone. He never missed. I remember he didn't miss a match or anything like that, and he had a bunch of stitches. It was all taped up and everything. I remember we had a riot in Somerset, and I punched some mark, and I punched one, and he put his head down, so I got him, but I broke my hand, so I had to get a cast on it. But then the baby faces would work on the cast, so I just I cut that sumbitch off, and my hand didn't heal right, but what the hell, right? That's the way it was at that time in pro wrestling. And that was the norm, and what an adrenaline rush got doing that. So it was fun. and what the hell? And Randy, he wanted to fight anybody for no reason anyway.
You were part of ownership in ICW, and you mentioned before how sometimes the boys made more money than you guys did as ownership. How much money would someone like Izzy have made to manage on these shows?
Oh, he's lucky to average $40 a night, 7 days a week.
And what about, let's say, the Devil's Duo?
Oh, it'd be the same thing.
Same thing. So manager and wrestler got the same pay.
Yeah. If you didn't, there was nobody. Everybody pretty much got the same thing unless you was really green and you get the big 2.5, but you got free trans they paid for it, which is the big deal. And then you were safe. And that's how we existed. It was a rough life, but we was there to learn. It was a stepping stone in the territories. You're trying to get a year or two under your belt, then you could go on to somewhere else. And you go on to somewhere else, and you go on to somewhere else. Pretty soon, 10 years down the line, you've had 3,000 matches. You've learned to work babyface, heel, an aggressive heel, a chicken shit heel, a technical babyface, a high flyer, whatever they need, and you pretty much learn the business. So you could go in and walk in the first time, and everybody was sort of universally trained. And you could go and have a 30-minute match, and you walk in, and they'd tell you you're going 30 minutes through. When they would go through, there was no phones, there was no way to communicate. You had separate dressing rooms and stuff, and might go 30 minutes with somebody the first time you ever seen them and not even know their name. And the ref might say, "Okay, you guys are going through. You got 30, okay? Boom." And you're talking with a guy and acts like you're Chahan and is going ropes. And I said, "What do you do good?" I said, "If I call something and you don't get it, just say, oh, I don't do that well. Don't worry, I'll figure it out. I know how to get us here," because the heels ran the show. The heels were good. And the babyface all they had to do was shut up and listen, and they'd have a good match.
You mentioned how Roop and Orton would leave, and they left in 1981 to go to Bill Watts. And right around this period of time, slowly but surely, one by one, guys started leaving to the point where by the end of 1983, it was really just the Poffos. Even you were gone by that period of time. Do you remember how and why Izzy left? I remember him showing up working on Georgia TV, but do you remember how and why he left?
No, it was a danger issue. Izzy was married. And then a lot of times they needed more money and we couldn't give it to them, or we go out of business. You know, it's like somebody working at McDonald's for minimum wage, and they said, "Well, I can't work here. I got to get another job because I got to survive and I'll make enough money." Well, we understood that. So, and they kept the belts on us because we wasn't going anywhere. Because it'd be like when Ron Fuller give all those guys the power as bookers and this and that, all of a sudden he had other guys booking his territory, and half his guys in his territory went against him. So basically ran him out of Knoxville, and he went down to Pensacola. And as far as working, I didn't have golly, to work for the Fullers was an honor. I never heard them raise their voice or anything, and money was always there, and they understood the wrestling business so good. And I worked for Ron in Southeastern when they was down in Pensacola, and I worked for them in Continental. I went down there and '83. Garvin got me booked down there.
Really?
Garvin booked me when I left ICW. I went down and did a couple TVs for, here was Garvin, who started all the shit in Knoxville.
Yeah.
And he was tight with Robert Fuller. So Robert, he just, so he booked me down to work for Fuller's for a week before I went into work for Bill Watts. And Garvin, he got me to work for Bill Watts there in 1983. When I left there, Jerry Stubbs was there as Mr. Olympia. He was tight with Fuller and them, so he brought me in for Ron Fuller after I left Bill Watts. Well, then when I got in with Ron, after Ron, he called up Bob Armstrong, and Bob Armstrong called up Ole. So when I was leaving there, Ole called, or I talked to him, and I come in to work for Ole right after the Black Saturday thing, or Black, whatever that was called, when Vince come over and took over. So I was going in to work for Ole, and because I remember DiBiase was there, and so I was working for Ole for 8 months until Crockett come in, and then as soon as Crockett come in, I was fired right away. But I got to work main events the last 6 weeks on the way out, and then I went and down and worked for Wahoo. And then you just kept on going and doing your shtick, meeting people, learning different angles, learning different styles, seeing different stuff on TV. And the cable TV wasn't so much, so you could go out there and do the same shit you did in Pensacola, and it could be fresh somewhere else. And now I'm rambling again. But anyway.
In terms of going to Watts, I mentioned Orton and Roop go there in 81. So many guys end up there. One Man Gang, who was Crusher Broomfield, ends up there. You end up there in 1983. Even the Devil's Duo, without that name, Jeff Sword and Doug Vines, they end up there for at least one TV taping, I remember, in 1982. How did so many guys get into there? You guys were all worried about being blackballed. You were running opposition to everyone. Was it Ernie Ladd? Because Ernie Ladd had been...
Yeah, Ernie Ladd come in, and he was buddies with Garvin, so he come in to scout talent. So he come in and he worked, I remember we worked Johnson City, we worked Frankfort, Kentucky, and Beckley, West Virginia, and we had some of the best houses we had there with Ernie Ladd because he was legitimate and everybody knew who he was. He was buddies with Garvin, so he went and saw Crusher Broomfield, and then all of a sudden the Crusher was going down and working for Bill Watts. Instead of making $200 and some, he was making $2,000 and some doing the same shit, right? So he was in hog heaven. And then so we had the pipeline there. So I know Rick McCord worked there too. Buddy Landell worked there too. And the list goes on and on of the ICW people. Watts didn't give a shit about blackball. If you could work, if you could do what you was told, help draw, you were a pro, that's all he cared about. Because he wanted to make money and you wanted to make money.
A quick aside, because I haven't asked you about this since it emerged, but what did you think when the Plan B video of Roop, Garvin, Orton, and Malenko finally got out?
Okay. I didn't see that until, I guess, was it last year, this year, whatever, right?
Yeah.
I saw that and I saw it and I looked at it and I said, no, they were bluffing. All they was doing is to make it look like they weren't bluffing because they wasn't, because they all went on to keep on wrestling. That was the only thing they knew. I don't think Garvin had a high school education. You know what I mean? And that's all these guys knew was pro wrestling. And it was a good bluff and whatever, but they wouldn't have done that. There ain't no way.
What was your impression?
At least in my mind. I went, holy moly, when I saw that shit, right? Then I just said, no, now they're working the workers. So, and that's what I believe. And I think that they wasn't going to do, they just wasn't going to do that, because then they wasn't going to piss in the chili for everybody.
Back to Izzy Slapowitz. After ICW closes down and everyone goes their separate ways, do you stay in touch with him at all? Do you see him or talk to him any point before Mike Mondo's seminar in New York?
Not really, because you got to remember, then there was barely any cable TV, and I didn't see it anyway because we was wrestling all the time. And you didn't, the guys used to have the big, like the ledger, the address book, right? you knew everybody's number, but there wasn't cell phones or anything, and you couldn't have $100 phone bill a month. Are you kidding me? That you didn't have no money to pay on that phone and stuff like that. So all the years I was wrestling, the only one that ever kept in touch with me and called me weekly was the Buddy Wayne from Buddy Wayne Wrestling School from Portland, Oregon. I met him in the Maritimes in 1988 when he was out there, and but we always conversed on the phone for years and years and years and years and years. But that was the only guy I really talked to on a consistent basis.
Was there any sort of special connection when you would run into an old ICW guy, like you running into Izzy at that seminar? Just because you guys didn't just work for the same company. You guys were the Outlaws. You guys were the Rebels. You guys ran opposition to everyone. Is there a certain relationship that you have with the guys that work there that's different than the guys you worked with in other territories?
Yeah, we would have. I remember one time, it's like we go to Southern Illinois and we'd have the Heels. Miser might buy a $33 room, is like 1980, right? And we got 16 guys sleeping there. You know what I mean? On the floor, underneath the sink and whatever. And we didn't spend no money. And then we'd get with the fans and the girls that we'd have they'd give us food and stuff, take us to the next town and this and that. The ring crew would be there because we used a ring we had a ring on the west side, which was housed in Southern Illinois. Then we kept one, the Spot Show ring. We had the ring that was in Johnson City. And so we were running all the way from Missouri all the way to West Virginia in opposition to everybody. So we had different rings we would use. And some of them were 16, some of them were 18, some of them were rope, some of them were like boxing rings and whatever. And you had to know how to work, bump, and you had to know your rings too. And ain't like you had the perfect giant bobber rings or the perfect WWF rings and nothing hurts. Some of this shit would goddamn kill you. It hurt so bad. But anyway, wait to whatever I was talking about.
Well,
but when you were an ICW guy, you had a special bond forever. And now all the stuff and the hard times you went through, now that's the great part of wrestling. It wasn't about the money. It was about the journey of getting there, telling the stories, this and that. And it was just what a good time it was. And you'd see somebody, you go back. Remember we had this riot in this town, whatever. Remember Ramona and Eileen in Pikeville? Remember all this and that, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And it was just, it was always good reminiscing with everybody.
Well, Rip, as we wrap up this segment, and I want to thank you for, again, appearing on the Superpodcast. When you look at Izzy Slapowitz, what is the legacy that he leaves behind when it comes to ICW? And also, what are your thoughts upon hearing of his passing earlier this week?
Well, I put a bunch of pictures up on Twitter or whatever that over the years when he was my manager at Mississippi, some pictures when he was ICW, when we was at that seminar together, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And it just shows you, how stuff in your life can change in a moment. And all of a sudden, all of a sudden somebody's gone. He went in for some kind of back surgery and had some kind of complications. He had a heart attack, a stroke during that. And all of a sudden, hours later, they said the next day he was gone. And you better, if you got troubles with somebody, it's best to make up because it ain't worth it. Holding a grudge, when you hold a grudge, you're mad about something from 40 years ago on a bad payoff or whatever. You go into this world with nothing and you leave with nothing and try to have a good as time as you can. And it's like when you're in the wrestling business, hell, I've been in since the 70s and I wouldn't have rather done anything else in the world. And this is when you got baseball players making all I ever wanted to do was be a wrestler. And I was going to figure out how I was going to get in there, and I did. And if you got in the wrestling business a long time ago, there wasn't any wrestling schools. The only one I knew was Vern Gagne's, and he was going to let me into his camp. But in the meantime, I got my Carlin Hildegard boots. I got my Shimmer cape. I got all my boxing boots and everything, and I'd bullshit my way in to start having my first match at Oak Hill, West Virginia, WOAY TV. Tonight I bet the Cuban Assassin. A couple of weeks later, B.B. Coleman took me to the WWF TV, and then I worked TVs for the Sheik, started with Dick the Bruiser. Met Lanny Poffo working for Dick Goulas on a Christmas night spectacular in 1977, and the list goes on and on. You meet people, and that's how it starts, and you shake your head, and you tell people stories. You couldn't make them up because they were so outlandish, and all of a sudden you look back and you smile and you say, what a life I've lived. And I wouldn't have traded for anything, and it was never about the money.
There you hear it, the hustler Rip Rogers, a friend of the show, someone who I am sure you'll be hearing back on these airwaves again in the future. But right now, it is time for Book of the Week. And this week, Book of the Week is actually going to be a bunch of books, several books, many, many, many books that you can get at Crowbar Press, crowbarpress.com. Of course, just recently, Scott Teal and Crowbar Press have put out a collection, 1970 and 1971, all of the programs that Championship Wrestling from Florida put out. This is a really great way to find out about all the different programs, all the different feuds, all the different matches that were taking place in 1970 and 1971 in Florida. There are so many great books, biographies, autobiographies, history books, collections of interviews, Scott's Wrestling Archive Project. I highly endorse, I encourage you to go, if you are a historian and someone who cares about wrestling history and trying to figure out how this crazy business came together, go to crowbarpress.com. Let them know you heard about it right here on the 605 Super Podcast. Now, you can get those books at crowbarpress.com, but there's lots of other items that you can get at Amazon, whether it's books or clothing, perhaps crayons, records. I don't know why I threw crayons in there, probably because I just had to buy those twistable crayons for my daughter. But there's so much you can get at Amazon. And if you're going to go to Amazon.com, don't forget to use our promo link, tinyurl.com/superpod Amazon. By using that link, you don't do anything differently than you would normally do at Amazon.com. You spend the same amount of money that you would spend at Amazon.com. It's just we get a little bit of love and support from Jeff Bezos and our friends at Amazon. They say, hey, how did this person end up here? Oh, it was the 605 Super Podcast that sent them here. So, for whatever it may be, tinyurl.com/superpod Amazon. Lots of other shows have links they want you to use. Lots of other shows beg you to use their links. You need to ask yourself, who should I support? Who puts the care into the quality of the show? Who just shits at a show, doesn't care about the audio quality, doesn't care about how they speak to the audience, and who actually pays attention to detail, tries to get things right, researches, puts out good audio? I think if you ask yourself any of these questions, the answer will be quite obvious. It will be very, very clear. When it comes down to it, when it comes down to them or us, fuck those guys. Support the Super Podcast. Support your Super Podcast. And with that, we're going to go to our main event, an interview with Scott Teal of Crowbar Press. A few notes here about this interview. One, I want to mention that this interview has been reviewed by Arcadian Vanguard's corporate counsel to make sure that there is no exposure for myself, the great Brian Last, the 605 Super Podcast, or Arcadian Vanguard LLC, as well as the subject of the interview, Scott Teal. I'm very happy to say there's nothing actionable in this interview. And with that, we're able to run with it. A couple other notes about it. I want to mention that this originally was a longer interview, and it will now be broken into two parts. The second portion of this interview dealt with Scott's relationship and the fallout of that relationship with Rocky Johnson. Of course, Scott wrote Rocky's biography, Soul Man, that was out on ECW Press. We actually reached out to ECW Press earlier today to confirm, and it is in fact true. It has been pulled from the market due to various issues with the text. That's a nice way of putting it. But it is no longer for sale. It is now a collector's item. It's very, very hard to get a hold of one of these. I encourage you, if you get a chance, do it today. It's going to be like the Gary Hart book, and everyone's going to want one. But due to Rocky Johnson's passing today, as we are recording this portion of the show, we are not going to play part 2 of this interview this week. It'll either be on episode 102 or 103. And just so everyone knows the schedule, between episode 101, which is this one, and 102, we will be putting out a Pampero Furpo special featuring interviews with historians, some people who knew Pampero, as well as some classic audio that has not been heard since it originally aired on TV. So that is the schedule, and the Rocky Johnson portion of this interview will not be airing this week. It will be airing in a few weeks on the Superpodcast. One other note here I want to say, because you'll hear what Scott has to say about his relationship with CAC and exactly what went down. But I spoke to him again a few days ago, and I want to make mention that his one concern is that he doesn't want anyone to think his comments about the events that led to his resignation reflect badly on the Cauliflower Alley Club organization. Scott loves the CAC and everything it stands for, but his concern is with the people who are running the organization without any checks and balances. He wants to be sure that nobody sees this interview as an attack on the Cauliflower Alley Club. He simply wants the story told about why he resigned and the events that pushed him to making that decision. And with that said, let's now roll with it. Here is my conversation with the publisher of Crowbar Press, wrestling historian Scott Teal. I am very happy today to welcome back to the Superpodcast a man who has done so much in and around professional wrestling. You probably best know him as the publisher of Crowbar Press. He's one of wrestling's premier historians, Scott Teal. Scott, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Brian. I'm glad to be here again, as always.
You know, each year we do our State of the Union for Crowbar Press, where you talk about the books that are on the docket for the coming year and the projects you're working on. And you just recently appeared on our Hall of Fame special, where you and Jim Cornette talked a little bit about your ballots and who you voted for the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. But I did want to talk to you about a few other things outside of those usual topics, because I'm sure you've heard it from people you know, but I've heard from a lot of people, hey, where's Scott Teal? You're someone who has had a big presence online. Obviously, you have your great Crowbar Press Archives group on Facebook. You're now on Twitter even. You're someone that is constantly putting out content, and all of a sudden you have not been around. You have been kind of quiet, and I've heard from a lot of people, where's Scott Teal? Do you know what's going on with Scott Teal? So I thought today would be a good opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what's been going on in your life and in your relationship with professional wrestling in the last, I guess, year or so that we'll be talking about here. Real quick, Scott, before we get going with anything else, for anyone who's new to you, for anyone who has maybe gotten your books but doesn't know anything about your background, someone who hears you on the show talking about your projects but doesn't know about your background, if you don't mind, can you briefly talk a little bit about your background in professional wrestling, what you have done?
Well, I just started out as a fan in 1968, fell in love with it. By 1971, I was going to the matches in Tampa, and shortly after that, early 1972, I already latched on to trading results with people around the country up until that time, trading results, programs, magazines, things like that, and corresponding with different people. And at some point, I decided they had things in the magazines back then days called Fan Club Corner, named something like that, and it listed people. They listed their address in the magazines, and some people would say, I want to trade results with people from Florida or Georgia. And you'd write them, send them results from Tampa or wherever, and they'd send you sheets same way back to you. And somewhere along the line, I got interested and got the idea of creating a bulletin, a newsletter. And I started sending out a little newsletter called the Tampa Scene, and it was strictly results from Tampa. And as I got a little bit more wise to the business, I realized there was wrestling in other places like Fort Myers, Miami, St. Petersburg, Jacksonville. And I developed correspondence around Florida. And I changed the name of the bulletin to Florida Fanfare because it was pretty much encompassed the whole state. I did that 72, 73, and 74. I moved to Nashville to go to college. And I really didn't, I had a real low profile for the first year. I didn't know a whole lot of the guys that worked up here. And I didn't go to the matches. I'd say I went maybe 9, 10 times, take pictures. Once in a while, one of the guys from Florida would come in and see me. Of course, remembered me from there. Even though I never had a big, really wasn't attached to the business at all in Florida. I really knew very few people, but just, the ones I did, when they did come up to Nashville, I got a chance to just renew acquaintances. And I only had a couple wrestlers that I could consider really good friends when I was in Florida. But when I came to Nashville, for that year, I went a few times and took pictures at ringside. And one day, Don Green, I'd become good friends with, asked me to go to Huntsville. And while I was down there, Nick Goulas sent somebody out, and he says, Nick Goulas wants to see you in the back. Well, I had heard a few of the stories about Nick and his temper and just how he sort of treated people. And I was sort of scared, but I went back there and he asked me to come to work for him. He said he had seen my work in the magazines and wanted to know if I'd do that. And to make a short story shorter, I ended up doing not only the photography for Nick and the promotion, but I did all the publicity pictures for the guys. And also ended up doing a program called Slamagram. So I did the arena programs for about 6 years and had a ball. I mean, it was a dream come true actually working for a promotion. I just fell into it. I never sought it out. I never, asked, say, hey, I'd like to come work in the office or do this or do that. But just something really just fell into my lap, thanks to Nick and his son, George Goulas. George was, I'm sure George was very instrumental in getting me, bringing me to the attention of Nick, even though I'd never met George to that point.
There's going to be a lot of fans listening to this surprised that you're from Florida and not Tennessee.
Oh, I know. That's true. That's true. But yeah, that's where my roots were for 6 years. I was very, active, going to the wrestling matches and learning and meeting new fans and traveling in Florida and it's funny. I went to Jacksonville, Tallahassee, of course, Tampa. I never made it over to Orlando, down to Miami. I never made any of those shots. I don't know why. I wish I had now. It's, you look back on your life and there's regrets you have, that's one of them, that I never took the time, not only to not go to Miami or Orlando, but the fact that I never went to the Kiel Auditorium, never went to Madison Square Garden. The only place I ever saw pro wrestling before I actually got into the business was in Atlanta. And I went to a few shows in Georgia. I made a trip up there a couple times, went to the Omni a few times and shot pictures. But I never made any of those great places, Dallas Sportatorium, all the big Charlotte Park Center. I wish I'd gone to those places just to say I'd been there. In fact, I only went to Knoxville once or twice. One time, I forget who it was, asked me to ride over with him, one of the wrestlers, so I rode over, and of course I knew all the guys there because they switched talent. Ron Fuller switched talent back and forth from Knoxville to Nashville, so it was sort of nice going to see that. It was at the Knoxville Coliseum. I never did have the opportunity to go Chilhowie Park, but like I said, that's you grow up and you look back on things, and there's things you regret not doing, and that's definitely one of them.
Nick Goulas closes up in 1980, I believe. At that point, you leave wrestling, correct? You're done with wrestling for a considerable period of time.
Famous last words. Yeah, I guess I'm through with wrestling. I won't have anything to do with wrestling again. Well, that held true until about 1992, and a guy called me one day. I don't even know how he got my name, but I was one of the very few people that owned a computer. I owned an Apple IIgs, and I had learned to make flyers, and I love doing that kind of stuff. And one day, this guy, his name was Don Rowlett, he's putting on a convention, Nashville Wrestling Collectors Association or something like that. He's putting on a convention. He's bringing in all these top names, talent from all over the country for this convention. It was going to be a banquet and a flea market type thing. And he wanted me to go to know if I'd help him with create flyers since I had a computer. And I told him, sure. So during the course of this, he called me one day and he says, guess what? I said, what? He says, I just talked to Dick Steinborn. And now Dick and I went back to about 1975 in Tennessee. We became really good friends. But I hadn't talked to him since, I got out of the business in 80. In fact, Dick was there in 1980 when Buddy Fuller took over from Nick Goulas. And I worked closely with Dick during that time. Well, the guy, Don Rowlett, he says, I just talked to Dick Steinborn, and he asked me whatever happened to Scott Teal. And sure enough, a light went off in my head. And believe it or not, that's where the idea for my newsletter, Whatever Happened To, came from. And I started that newsletter doing interviews with the old timers because most of those guys had disappeared. The fans didn't know where they were. So I'd start this newsletter. I published not only information about them, did short interviews, but I published their name, their address, and their phone number in this newsletter. And none of them had a problem with it. They all, in fact, you don't believe the calls I got from the wrestlers that really hadn't been in the limelight for decades, and telling me how much they enjoyed hearing from the fans, because they got letters from them, letters from fans asking them to send them pictures, autographed pictures, and they absolutely ate it up. These guys had been in the limelight for years and years and years, and all of a sudden they're shoved back into a corner, where nobody, the fans of today didn't even know who they were in 1992. Or didn't know where they were or anything. They felt like they had been forgotten. So it was a cool thing, not only for the fans to be able to contact the wrestlers, but for the wrestlers to once again get some of this adulation that they had gotten, when they were in the wrestling business. And 4 years later, Ole Anderson asked me to help him with his book. And the rest is history. Once Ole's book took off, J.J. Dillon, Ivan Koloff called me, and then it was Tony Atlas. Just one guy after another, and which leads up till today. I've published, I guess it's 45 books on the subject of pro wrestling.
And I'm assuming that you didn't do it to get rich, because it's very hard to make money with a lot of these things. They would appear to me to be labors of love. Is that correct?
Oh, I have books that I've sold, and granted, I knew going in. Some of these guys, one in particular, and he understands it. He says it. He even admits it, and his greatest claim to fame was he wrestled one time on television for Vern Gagne. Everything else was these small little independent shows around Indiana, Ohio, Michigan. That's all he ever did. But I wrote his book with him because his story to me was fascinating. It was about a journeyman wrestler, never made it in the business, but he wanted it so badly. And I just thought it was fascinating. Now, do you go into a situation like that, writing a book like that to make money? No, there's no way. It took me 2 years just to get my money back from what it cost me to publish the book, or to get the number of copies I did. But I love those stories because, guys, people say all the time, they say, wow, so-and-so ought to be a great interview because, he was main event. But I have found the guys on the undercard are, if not just as interesting, more interesting than the guys that are in the main events, because those were the guys in the trenches. Those were the guys fighting every day to get a decent payoff, from the promoters to make a living. And so yeah, I had you're not going to get rich writing books. When I go into a book with anybody, the first thing I say, first words out of my mouth is, if you're writing a book to make money, don't even bother, because there's probably not going to be any to be made. But if you want to write a book for your legacy and to preserve the history of the business and yourself, then let's go for it, because that's what I'm looking for. I'm wanting to preserve the history. It's not about the money. Wrestling fans, as a rule, do not spend money on books. If I was going to make money writing books, I'd be writing about football, baseball, basketball, or something else.
We're going to talk a little bit more about your books, and specifically a book you worked on within the last year, but I want to take a sidestep here, because one of the things I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is your relationship with the Cauliflower Alley Club, and specifically your recent involvement with them. But to take a step back from that, what is your history with CAC? Were you a member way back? When did you first join? Did you get involved in any of their annual reunions? What is your history with CAC before your recent involvement on, I believe you were on the executive board, weren't you?
Yes, I started with CAC probably around 1993, shortly after I started my Whatever Happened to newsletter. Up until then, I really didn't even know what CAC was, because when I got out of pro wrestling, I just put it behind me. That was it. I was, didn't follow it, didn't read about it, except for an occasional Observer. So a friend of mine used to get the Observer, and he'd pass them on to me, and I'd read them, which I thought was fascinating. At that time, it was just the most incredible stuff. But I think I joined in 93, and I went to my first reunion, and I want to say 94, 95, something like that. It may have been 93. Had a ball. But the funny thing is, and a lot of people don't know this, but when I went the first time, I forget, it was either the Plaza Hotel or there was another one. But when we got there was no room like they've got now. There was no gathering room, vendor room. It was simply the boys got to the hotel. They walked around the lobby, sat in the lobby and talked. There was no main gathering place. And one of the first things I did when I got home is call somebody. I don't remember who I called, but I said, or I may have emailed him even. That was the early days of email. But I said, you have got to have a room for people to meet in, because people walk around that hotel. You don't know where anybody is. You don't know where any of the wrestlers are. The wrestlers didn't know where each other. The only time you saw each other is if you just happened to run into each other or at the banquet that night. And sure enough, that next year they started they had a room, and it was the greatest thing because everybody could go to that room and hang out there. They knew everybody was going to come through there at one time or another. And the other thing is, it was around that same time that I actually created the first website for the Cauliflower Alley Club. Carl Lauer said something not long ago about J. Michael Kenyon being the guy that started the website. And I said, no. I said, Red Bastien turned it over to J. Michael Kenyon, but I was the one that created the website at the very beginning. But anyway, so that's sort of my history. 4 or 5 years later, I was asked to be on just on the general board, not the executive board, but on the general board. And I was for a few years. And some things happened in one of the meetings that I said, this isn't for me. I didn't want the negativity in my life. They made one of the executives made some references to a good friend of mine. He was calling roll is what he was doing, and to see who was at the meeting there in Vegas at the board meeting. And in the process, after he called out all the names that were there, he says, well, so-and-so is sick. So-and-so has to do this. And so-and-so, he's just not here. I think he just must not care enough to be here. Well, that set me off because this guy, I'll tell you his name is Les Thatcher. I said, Les is a good friend of mine, and he can't be here for reasons that are very valid. Number one, he doesn't have the money to get here. And it set me off. I stood right up. Of course, everybody else sat in there with their heads looking at the floor like the wrestlers always did when the promoters walked in. And, so it sort of set me off. And it wasn't long after I said, this isn't for me. I'm not going to sit there and let them say disparaging things about other board members when they're not there to defend themselves. That's not what I'm here for. So I quit. Still a member of the CAC. I still supported it. I still went to the annual reunions. And then about 2-3 years ago, Dean Silverstone approached me a few times about being on the executive board. And I just simply said, no, I'm not interested. I had problems with it before. I didn't enjoy myself. And it just was too much. I don't know, I just didn't care for it. And so then at my reunion here at our house, September a year ago,
Well, let me stop you there because not everyone will be aware of that. What is the reunion that you do at your house?
Angela, my wife, and I, we held a reunion every year in end of September. It started out as for the guys that worked for Nick Goulas, my friends, the guys I traveled up and down the road with. Most of these people hadn't seen each other, like we talked earlier, for years, decades. And so Angela and I brought them all together here for a reunion. My wife actually cooked lunch and dinner on Friday, lunch on Saturday, and then after 2 years, she was having dinner on Saturday night as well. And she actually prepared the meal for 70 to 80 people for 7 years. And we didn't charge anything. It was just something we did because we love these people. And so that's the story of the reunion. But it started out as the guys that worked for Nick Goulas, and over time, over 3-4 years, of course, a lot of the guys were dying, and so we said, let's open it up to some other people, some of the people that I knew that I was really good friends with. So we had great times. I mean, I just loved the reunion. It was a lot of work, a lot of money, but we had a ball every time we had it, and we didn't have it this year. Whether we'll have it again, I'm not real sure. But we did it for 7 years, and I gave awards, and we just had a great time.
So to go back to CAC, Dean Silverstone, who is, correct me if I'm wrong, he's been on the board of directors for probably 20 years or so.
Oh, at least that, yes.
Dean Silverstone, who you've published his book, he's someone you have a long relationship with. I remember his columns in Whatever Happened To when I was a teenager reading that. He asked you to be on the board. Take it from there. Pick up the story from where I interrupted you before.
Sure. Dean had asked me, and I turned him down each time. I just wasn't interested. And then at our reunion a year ago, Brian Blair approached me And I said, well, Brian, I don't know. I told him a little bit about what had gone down before. And I said, I love going to Cauliflower Alley. I love the Cauliflower Alley. I said, but I just think getting involved, it'd be a mistake. Well, he continued to, he mentioned it, talked to me about that weekend. And then Dean came up the same week. Dean was here as well. And he came up, started talking to me about it. And I told them both I'd give them my decision in a week or so. This was shortly after Morgan Dollar left the board, had quit. So I talked to my wife about it. We talked about it, and finally came to the decision that yes, I'd take the executive vice president spot that they offered me, and I told them I'd do the best of my ability to to help the club grow and move forward. And sure enough, that's what I did. And from September through end of April, I worked almost full time. It pretty much was full time. I restructured the club. I rebuilt the website just to make it a little easier for people to find ways to buy tickets. I handled the vendor room, helped Dean. Dean was just great as far as, handling. He handled the finances and sort of the financial secretary. He took the orders from the website, passed the information on to me so I could send people information about the hotel. But anyway, I did that for about 8 months, I guess, full time, pretty much full time.
I have right here letterhead from the CAC. I'm going to guess this is probably from around 1999 because it's after Art Abrams and Archie Moore had both passed away. And Archie Moore passed away in 98. Here's the board of directors listed here. President Luthez, Vice President Carl Lauer, he was also chairman. Vice President and Treasurer Chris Drake. Brittany Brown, Recording Secretary. Maria Bernini, Communications. And then Bill Anderson, Sid Balkin, Gary Ballin, Penny Banner, Richard Beyer, better known as the Destroyer, Dick Beyer. Fred Blassie, Valerie Bosch, the widow of Paul Bosch. Historian Tom Burke, Mike Chapman, Don Curtis, legal counsel Tom Drake, Dan Gable, Vern Gagne, Sheldon Goldberg, J. Michael Kenyon. Unfortunately, they put a period after the J here, which is incorrect.
Yes.
Buddha Khan, Walter Kowalski, John Philip Law as the real advisor, Al Mandel, Phil Maurer, William Murdoch, Michael Neparadny. Let me try that again.
Neparadny.
Michael Neparadny, the official photographer, Pat Patterson, Dean Silverstone, Gordon Soley, and Ella Waldick, with regional directors listed as Red Bastine in Texas, Al Campbell in Canada, George Napolitano in New York and New Jersey, William Pappas in Oregon, Steve Ricard in New Zealand, and Russ Rodriguez in Palm Springs, California. So that's the board of directors from, I think, around 1999-2000. When you were asked to join by Dean Silverstone, who was on the board of directors?
Oh, boy. Well, that's the interesting thing. Before I was asked, a year before, Gloria Lovell was the recording secretary. You had Scott Hosey in charge of the vendors. Royal Duncan is the newsletter publisher. Morgan Dollar was the executive vice president. They had several others. I'm drawing a blank. I know. I can't recall right offhand, but during that year, things were just getting worse and worse on the board. There was a lot of tension. Most of the meetings they had the meetings, like conference calls to have their meetings. Most of those meetings ended up in screaming matches, cursing, you name it. It just, they could not work together. And it had never been, they've always had problems. Every board has, dissension. Guys, some people want one thing with someone another, but this was just absolutely out of hand. 4 of the board members and some of the associate board members during the past year and a half quit. Absolutely through with CA. Scott, there's somebody else I just thought of. But anyway, 4 or 5 of the board members quit, plus some associate members because they were so fed up with the way things were being done. the rules weren't being adhered to. When something was brought up and the board voted on it, says, okay, we're going to do it this way, or we want this, we don't want this. Well, then one of the grand muhahas took it upon themselves to do those things anyway. It was his way or the highway. It didn't matter what the board voted on. So it just over time, just, tempers got that flared, and the members got fed up because they weren't being listened to. The rules weren't being followed, and they all quit. And I think Morgan Dollar was probably the first of the bunch. There may have been one other.
I remember a few years back, there was an incident where Howard Brody quit and then started talking about CAC. I remember he was on Jim Cornette's podcast talking about problems he had with CAC. Yes,
the 4 or 5 I'm talking about were just in the last year and a half. Before that, there was several others that quit too, and they never even came back to the CAC, even to the meetings. They were so fed up. So ultimately, they were without anybody to handle the vendor room, anybody to do the registration, anybody to handle the vice president spot. And there was something else, I can't remember what it was. Royal Duncan, he was ready to quit. They were just up in arms. So when I took over, I ended up inheriting all 4 board member spots. It wasn't supposed to be that way, but I did it because when I took over, it was like late October, and the reunion was coming up a few months later, 6 months, 5 months later. And we didn't have time to find, somebody else and get other things rolling. So I just rolled with it. I just took things underhand and did what I could do to improve things. I want you to understand, Brian, I'm not saying any of this because I'm looking for an attaboy or I did this, I did that. I'm saying all this because I want people to understand that there was a lot of things said and done during this time that I took care of, and yet in the long run, I was expected to do it. It was almost as if I was an employee. It was like, you do what I want, or you're in charge of this and you're in charge of that. And yet other people weren't doing anything, or very little anyways.
Well, let me jump in here and ask you a couple things. One is, how is the board of directors put together? How does someone get on the board of directors? Secondly, how is the president and CEO elected to that spot? And third of all, does the president or any of the board members draw a salary from CAC?
No, there's no compensation whatsoever. Before I got on the board, I had always heard that, there's some of them were getting their rooms comped, and I don't know if that's the case or not. I haven't seen that, or nobody has said that when I was on the board. I do know we do get 3 people, which I wasn't one of them, but 3 people on the board, executive board, do get a suite at the Gold Coast, but they still have to pay for it, but it's the same price as what everybody else pays for a regular room. So that's the only real compensation that anybody gets. They still pay for their banquet tickets. They still pay for their own transportation, and there is absolutely no salary whatsoever.
And how does someone get on the board, and how is the president elected?
The president, be honest with you, I don't know who makes that decision. I do know Carl Lauer, I believe, was one of the ones instrumental in getting Brian Blair on the board as the president. But I don't know how that comes about. My guess is, if just like all the other officers, if we need an executive vice president, then during one of the conference calls between all the other executive board members, someone says, we need an executive vice president. Let's, there's a guy named Brian Last, I think, ought to be executive vice president. He'd do a great job. And so they talk about it, they vote on it, and I guess the majority wins. I don't think we added any. No, we didn't add any executive board members while I was there. Of course, they have. I don't know if they have yet, because the VP spot is still open, from what I understand. But it's pretty much just the decision of the 4 or 5 people who make up the executive board.
A friend of this show who's been on many segments, many popular segments, is George Shire, wrestling historian. He was on the board too, correct?
Yes, he was. He was on the, I don't know if he was ever on the executive board. He was on the associate board for many, many years. George was a really valuable member for the CAC. One of the things, he was very strong as far as the historians go. Taking care of making sure the historian award goes to somebody that's really, deserving of it. So George was very, very instrumental. Of course, he's been on the associate board for many years. Shortly after I resigned, he resigned, and I immediately, as soon as I read his message about he's resigning, I immediately sent a message to Brian and the others saying I had no clue that he was going to resign. It has nothing to do with me, because I didn't want them coming back and say Scott's talking to people and getting them upset and getting them to resign, because nothing of the sort happened. I hadn't said anything to anybody other than the fact that I resigned.
Well, before we get there, because obviously I want the story of why you resigned and when you resigned, but there's still a lot of story to tell to get there, I would assume. Let me ask you about Brian Blair. When he showed up at your reunion at your house, your annual reunion, had you met him before? Did you have any relationship with Brian Blair?
Oh, yeah, I knew Brian. I sure did. I knew him both from the CAC reunions. I don't know where I first met Brian. It had been back before, just probably shortly before he published his book, Smarten Up, Say It Right, because I remember talking to him about the book. I did a short interview with him about it to help promote the book. And so, yeah, so I knew Brian. I always had a lot of respect for Brian.
And obviously for you to consider, and it's beyond consideration, for you to join the executive board and get so involved, and I think you're one of these guys, it's hard for you to get involved with a project and not really put your heart and soul into it, from my knowledge of how you do things. I'm going to assume you wouldn't have done any of that if you didn't have a good working relationship with Brian at that point.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. When I jump into something, it doesn't matter what it is. It's, I go in feet first. There's no halfway. It's like my wife was recently saying something about comic books. I collected comic books when I was in high school, all the way up through probably 82. And I still have most of them. And after all this happened, I said, I'm backing off from wrestling. I'm going to do some other things. For now, I'm going to start watching more movies. We got a home theater in our basement. I watch movies, and I decided I'm going to sell my comic book collection. Of course, I also started buying comics, but I've been working on that 24/7 for the past 5-6 weeks, maybe longer, because I'm trying to get my books in condition to sell and get them in the hands of people that, that would like, would appreciate them, because, I'm getting older, I'm 66 years old. And all that stuff. The same with my wrestling stuff. A lot of the wrestling stuff I'm starting to get out to other people, because I'm not going to be here forever. And my kids, they couldn't care one little thing about my wrestling, anything to do with wrestling. So I'm going ahead and putting a lot of it on eBay and working on that. But that's what I've been doing 24/7. Like I said, I jump in feet first with all this, and I'll get back to wrestling shortly, but I just had to get away for a little bit and just clear my mind.
Now, I'm sure a lot of what you just said, now this is two separate things. You talked about resigning from the board, and you talked about working on comic books 24/7. I'm sure a lot of people who know you, a lot of people who have followed your work are probably pretty surprised to hear that. So let's get back to the story of you and CAC. You agree to join the board. You immediately dive headfirst in, and I've heard from a lot of people who have attended CACs for years, and they certainly recognized all your contributions. It stood out. The website obviously had a change in look. There was a lot more being done on social media. I know Roy Lucier ended up getting involved. When did things start turning sour? Did things turn sour for you before the convention and reunion?
No, I didn't have any problems whatsoever. I mean, I was working hard, taking care of all these things. Like I said, restructuring the registration process and creating the website, making sure the website worked correctly for people who ordered. And I also worked with the vendors. I set up, contacted hundreds of vendors, filled the room, and I was told that this was the first year that they made a decent amount of money from the reunion, from the vendors. Every other year, it's been sort of a wash. They haven't made very much, and it's the first year they've ever sold out the reunion as far as the vendors go. So I was tickled to death about having being responsible for a lot of that. So The sour part came, Angela and I, my wife, we got to Vegas on Saturday. Actually, I think we got there Friday, and we did a few tourist things Friday and Saturday. Saturday night we went and started getting some things together. We had a lot of stuff with us. Sunday night, the day before the reunion, we were in that room as soon as we could get in there. It was like 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday. And we started setting up for the reunion. I had also created 80 posters. There was something like 1,600 pictures of pro wrestlers on display at the reunion. And we had to set all those up, get all the registration packets stuffed and all the things put out, signs, tablecloths. We did all that. We were there until midnight Sunday night working. And by the time we got back to the room and to sleep, it was after 1 o'clock. We were up at 6 o'clock the next morning, back in the room to make sure everything was set up, to get the table set up for ticket sales and registration. And we had those doors open 1 minute late, 10:01. It was supposed to open at 10 o'clock, but I told them we are going to have that room open. It's going to be open when we say it was, and it was 10:01. So we ended up opening up. Darlene Crease handled registration, had Bob Cook and Lily helping her. 10 minutes after we opened the doors, Brian Blair walks up and he says, Scott, he says, why is, and it was a stern tone of voice, why is Darlene on registration? I need her selling tickets. I said, Brian, it's only 10 after 10. We got all weekend for one thing. I said, the other thing is we've been talking all along that Darlene handles registration. He says, no. He says, not the registration, not the table. She handles registration getting set up. And I said, well, no, Brian, I set up registration. I'm the one that did all that. I had everything ready. So Brian he just could not contain himself about how it was messing things up because they could not sell. I mean, here we had 3 days to sell these, he wanted her to sell raffle tickets. Had 3 days to sell raffle tickets. And it's only 10 after 10 after we open the doors. And he's concerned because she's not already selling tickets. And I said, well, Brian, he says, she's got to sell tickets. So he pulls her off the table. I said, well, Brian, and we stood right there in front of, there were several people right there. I know who they are too, because they've mentioned it to me, stood right there listening to all this. They could not believe, and they've told me since, they could not believe he was talking to me like he was. And I said, Brian, who am I going to get for registration? He said, I don't know. That's your job. Now, my job was executive vice president and the vendors. So now I'm in charge of registration as well. Meanwhile, what is he doing? He's having lunch, walking around, glad handing his friends, everybody. He wasn't in the vendor room not even an hour a day. But I got there. Angela ended up taking over registration. Angela comes over and she says, Scott, I'll handle it. So she goes over there and she ran it just like a charm. She ran registration all 3 days. She stood behind that table, and she was just there to support me. In fact, she was there to help me sell my stuff at my vendor table, which I paid for. Even as executive board members, we still pay all the fees. So if I wanted a vendor table, I paid for it, just like everybody else. But I wasn't at that table half the time because I was walking around taking care of business here, taking care of business there, putting out fires. And so now nobody's at my table most of the time. And Angela's handling registration. So we did that. But I asked Brian at that point when he said that about it, I'm in charge. I said, well, Brian, why am I in charge of everything? He says, well, that's just your job. So the vice president is in charge of everything. So we got a little hot, and we ended up going out in the hallway and talking it out. And I settled down. I said, okay, I'll handle it. But in my mind, I was determined next year wasn't going to be this way.
Well, let me stop you here if you don't mind, Scott, and jump in. You're doing all this. You're a member of the executive board. What was Brian Blair, the president and CEO of CAC, doing, and what were the other executive board members doing?
Well, Dean Silverstone, he stood behind that table the whole time, sold tickets. That he was in charge of selling when people, come in. Angela's job was, and Bob Cook and Lily, were in charge of getting everybody their packet, their name tags, and all that. Dean was in charge of selling tickets for people who hadn't already bought their reunion ticket. So he was there the whole time as well. He came in. He got there sometime late Sunday afternoon, and he was there the whole time we needed him. He didn't leave that table. Dean's a prince of men. I don't know if you know him or not, but I just can't say enough good things about Dean. But that was Dean's job, and he did everything, expected of him. And he couldn't leave the table. He had to do things. Now, Angela and I were in that registration room, or in the vendor room, from Monday morning at 6, and we didn't go back to our room till midnight that night. And it was the same both other days. We were there every morning printing name tags, handling all the little things that had to be done. And Brian, his job, I don't know. Every time I talk to Brian, and I asked him, I said, well, Brian, what can you do, as far as working? His answer is always, well, Scott, I've got to answer emails. I've got to answer phone calls. I answer emails and phone calls all the time. And he shows me his phone. I answer phone calls and emails all the time. I'm in charge of the vendor room. I'm in charge of was in charge of handling, getting set up for registration. I do all that as well, but I have to do all the other jobs too. That's what soured me on the whole process. Not the fact that I had to do so much. I was more than willing to do it because I knew it had to be done. I'm never one to shirk any kind of responsibility, and I'm gonna make sure it's going to get done. But you don't talk to me like you did. And the thing that really set me off and really led to me resigning. I mean, there was other things after that, but Wednesday night before the banquet, Tuesday night at the bank before the banquet, Angela, she says, "What about people that come in and don't have a reunion ticket, and when they come to the banquet?" So we talked about it, and she says, why don't I just sit at a table in front of the banquet doors, and when people come in, I'll be there with all the information. I've got their name tags, the ones that have registered, and the ones that need to buy a ticket, I can take care of selling them the ticket. And Dean Silverstone did that as well. Meanwhile, I'm inside running over, taking care of all the little things that had to be done in the banquet, making sure the WWE talent got in there. Making sure all the signs were on the table, making sure the video presentation was ready, and working with Roy Lusher on that. So Angela sat there Tuesday night before the reunion for an hour and a half to take care of tickets and late walk-ups, problems with guys who their wives didn't have tickets. I mean, we had one, it was just unbelievable, came up, one of the girlfriends of one of the wrestlers, just so indignant because her ticket wasn't there and she should have had a name tag. And oh my goodness, it was one thing after another. So Wednesday night, same thing, with the banquet. Well, Angela was busy putting out signs on the tables, trying to help me get everything done. Brian walks up and he says, "Scott, where's Angela? She needs to be selling tickets." That's his exact words. Now, who is Brian Blair to tell me what my wife should be doing? But that is Brian Blair's attitude. People work for him. He's the head honcho, but people work for him. And you're just a lowly employee. He talks the big game, but he treats you like dirt. And that's what he did to me that weekend. And that's what he did to Angela as well, even though she was putting in, working every day, all day long. Like I said, we never even got to lunch from the vendor room on those days. The first, real meal we had was that night, at the banquet. And even then, I didn't get to sit down about 10 or 15 minutes. So that all that together just absolutely left me. It just soured me on the whole process.
You say you were treated like lowly employees, but to clarify, you guys weren't employees. There was no salary. You weren't paid, and Brian Blair wasn't your boss, correct?
Absolutely. Right. And I don't mind doing all those things. I never complained about having to do the things. It was the way I was talked to, as if I was beneath, as I was a lowly employee who was expected to take orders when I was working, 6 a.m. to midnight every night. I don't know. We're volunteers. We don't have to, put up with that. We don't have to be talked to like we're dirt. But I stayed with it though. After that, I didn't resign right away.
Well, let me ask you a couple more things about the Vegas convention, because I've heard various things from various people. Obviously, the 605 Superpodcast had a pretty strong contingent there, but I also heard from people that weren't sitting at our tables. So let me ask you a couple things. I heard from several people, and obviously I heard a lot of great things about what you did. I heard a lot of great things about what Roy Lucier did. You guys brought a lot to the table this year that have been missing in past years at CAC. There is a feeling among some that Brian Blair was very interested in having fun, hanging out with his friends, with his former colleagues, instead of doing any actual duties on behalf of CAC. Would that be a fair assessment in your eyes, or is that off base?
I can't say whether that's what he was interested in because I never saw him. When I took over the position, in fact, one of the first things I said when I took it over and we got talking about the reunion, I said point blank, Brian, Dean, I have got to have you help me and walk me through the reunion while we're there and before, because I have no idea what my job responsibilities are. I don't know what to do or anything. That was part of the problem, because here I am, not a clue about how to do things, and I didn't see anybody. I mean, I saw Dean; he was selling the reunion tickets, but I didn't see Brian. He never came over and said, "Scott, do you need anything? Can I help you? Is there any questions I can?" Not once. I only saw him in the vendor room twice the whole 3 days. So that's was a big part of the problem. I figured everything out. I didn't, it was no big deal, but there was times that, I would have liked to have a sounding board say, hey, what if I try this or what if I do that?
And I'm assuming he got one of the suites that were offered at regular room rates.
Oh, yeah. President always gets that. And Carl had the other and Dean had the other. And I'm good with that. I didn't have any problem with that.
The big complaint I heard about the banquet was the length. That speeches ran long, that the entire event was way too long, that people got pooped, that people left. Whose responsibility does that fall on? How did that happen the way it happened?
Yeah, we sit down with every single person, and twice maybe or more. I even sent out emails to every honoree as an additional reinforcement of the rules. We tell everyone you've got 10 minutes, and that includes your presenter, not only your presenter, what his introduction speech, and then your speech, total of 10 minutes, no more. And yet we had guys go 30, 40 minutes or more, and it happens all the time. But that was under Brian's purview. Even though I helped try and, make sure they knew it by sending out emails in the days before it happened, that was Brian's responsibility. And I can't put a lot of blame on Brian, because he did and I did stress the fact that they had a specific amount of time. But what do you do? When these guys are up there getting their award, do you just get up there and pull them off stage, say, hey, your time's up? It's a hard thing to do. I remember back in the 90s, Red Bastien coming out onto the stage with this long hook. And I bet that thing was 8 feet long. And he would stretch it out and get the wrestler up there making his speech around the neck, just as a joke. But I remember him walking across the stage with that big hook like he was going to pull him off stage. But it's a hard thing to do. How do you go up and say, hey, man, your time is up? You got to, let's cut it. It's just I don't know.
I would wonder, did anyone say anything to Jim Ross? Because obviously he was the MC of the event, and he's really the main person that's actually on the dais that can move things along to the best of his capabilities there. Did anyone talk to Jim Ross about this?
Not that I know of. To me, the MC should know that that's his responsibility, is make sure things roll along. But again, Jim couldn't go up to those honorees and say, hey, you've already used up your 10 minutes. I'll give you another minute. He really can't do that. It's just a hard thing to do. I will say this. J.J. Dillon had the program. He was MC on Tuesday night. He ran that program like a pro. I'm not saying JR didn't, but J.J. Dillon is a master. He got up there. He spoke for each presenter that he brought up there, introduced. He didn't speak more than, I'd say, 30 seconds. He did exactly what he was supposed to do, got them on the stage, they did their thing, and then left. So that's just a little plug for JJ, because he's the best in my opinion.
I want to ask you about one of my personal issues with CAC. And obviously I don't attend and I'm not a member, but I think the core mission of CAC is so important to help out wrestlers who are struggling, especially the ones who are struggling for health reasons. And that's why it bothered me that Hannibal, who is someone, for the record, I don't like. I don't think he's very good at what he does, but I also don't think he's a very good person. He does all these videos at CAC. He films the events, he films the banquets, he films the speeches. Does CAC see any of that money? Because I went back and forth with Brian Blair a little bit about this on Twitter, and the way I came out of it was thinking Brian Blair has no idea how YouTube works.
Right.
But does CAC see any of that money? And if not, why wouldn't CAC try to build their own archive of footage instead of allowing someone else? If the vendors are all paying all that money to have a space in the vendors room, why is someone being allowed to shoot video and profit off it and not have CAC share in those profits, if not just do it themselves? Can you explain any of this to me?
Yes, a good example. Just before I went to, had to get security for the first seminar to make sure. That's another thing I was in charge of, was making sure we had somebody in place that when people came in to go into the seminar, that they had their name tag. So I was over there getting the guy set up. I went in there to be sure everything was rolling. I walked in to be sure Ron Hutchison and whoever he had on that first seminar had everything they needed, be sure they, had everything they needed for the seminar. And Hannibal's dad was standing there, and I saw them in there with the camera, and I said, "What are you filming on this?" He says, "We're shooting the whole seminar." I said, "What do you mean the whole seminar?" He says, "Well, we shoot the whole thing. We shoot everything." I said, "And what do you do with it?" He says, "Well, we put it online." I said, "What do you mean you put it online?" I said, I'm okay with you shooting it and using excerpts, maybe a minute of a seminar or a minute, partway through, a minute, half, 30 minutes later, a minute later, maybe 3 total minutes for the seminar. But if you're going to put all the seminars online, what does that encourage people to come to the reunion when they sit at home and watch it? And not only that, but there's people that bought reunion tickets and bought plane fares and pay for hotel rooms that they paid all that money to see these seminars. And yet you're giving it to everybody else in the world for free who don't support the CAC. He says, "Well, that's just the way." I mean, he's got a little huffy with me. He says, "Well, that's the way it is." He says, we put it all online, and that's it. So that's one of the things I was going to tackle this year, is what, because the CAC, there are ways. I talked with Roy Lucier about it, and there are ways we could monetize that. We're not going to make a fortune off of it, but I'll guarantee you that they're making something, or they wouldn't be doing it.
They're absolutely making money on it, and that's my point. It's either let him do it, and CAC gets a large portion of those profits, and YouTube is a very profitable exercise. Trust me, I have a little bit of background in this. Or CAC does it itself and profits off those videos, and that money goes back into the pot. And again, the core mission, help wrestlers in need. That gives you more money to play with. Maybe there won't be a $500 limit on helping out wrestlers per year. Maybe you can increase that if you can get more revenue in there. And I would even argue against your point. I certainly see the validity in your point, but my thing is, even if you're going to put up the whole thing, you don't have to do it right away. You could wait a little while so there is an exclusive period for the people who actually paid to attend that seminar. But that entire video could be making money for the CAC, which in turn makes money for the boys in need. I don't understand why that would be given away to someone to profit on their own. If no one else has that capability, unless you're going to tell me he's paying a vendor's fee, and then still I would question why he would be allowed to do that. I don't understand the logic or the reason behind it. I know that apparently Brian Blair and Hannibal have a good relationship, but as a businessman, that seems to be the height of stupidity to me.
I agree with you 100%. But even if they do get to air it all, what good does it do to come back after the reunion, put it all online, and then the rest of the year, it's forgotten? Everybody gets real excited. They watch it all. Well, you just made a point there. Why not put, say, 10 minutes on there? Next week, put 10 minutes of another seminar. The following week, 10 minutes of another seminar. Next week, come back and put 10 more minutes of that first seminar. Then next week. So all year long, that CAC is constantly in the minds of the people. Not just that one time a year. And then by the time the reunion gets here, it's forgotten. dole it out in portions so that every week there's something online, something new that reminds people of the CAC and what a great time we have at the reunion. But that's not the way they do it, and I don't understand that. Brian's thing, he came on in emails. He says, "Well, I understand that they're not really making any money on this. It's blah blah blah." Well, yeah, that's everybody's going to tell. That's what he's told. But it's that's the way it is. So I just said, okay, well, I was going to deal with that later. I wasn't going to deal with it then. I had enough on my plate after the reunion, just getting other things taken care of and revamping the website again for next year's tickets. So I just didn't even, follow that.
Well, I'm not going to harp on this too much because obviously I've expressed my point of view on this. I think it's financially irresponsible for CAC to operate the way it does right now with video content. But let's talk about you and your experience again. The convention was in April. Between April and when you resigned, what happened?
Well, I came back with I really didn't have a problem. I wasn't so soured that I was going to quit. Like I said, I came back and revamped the website. We had a lot of emails, all of us, the board, back and forth. And several things were done and said that really started me questioning why I was doing what I was doing. A couple things I put forth as ways to help us move into the 21st century, like online registration forms where people could actually fill out their information, online forms where the executive board could actually cast, if we had we have a motion brought up to something we need done. I could put it on there. All the members could go to that webpage and cast their vote. It would have been made it so simple rather than everybody having to get online or get on the phone on a conference call, set up the conference call, which is something else I did, set up the conference calls. But my response, the stuff like that I got, one person in particular, he says, "We don't need that." He says, "Cauliflower Alley's been doing things the way we've been doing it for 30 years. He says, "Sometimes technology is just a problem." And I'm like, "Really? You don't want to move forward when you've got modern technology that I've got? You don't have to do anything. I've got it figured out. I've already got it already. All I have to do is set it up online, and we do it." But no. And there was several emails just like that where two people in particular came back at me in a very nasty, hateful tone. One of the high muckety mucks came back and said, I forget what it was about, but came back just, yeah, blah, blah, blah. I said this, that. But he completely missed what I was saying. I didn't even say anything about what he was saying. And I wrote back, I said, "Hey," I said, "you just emailed me about something that I didn't even talk about, and you've gone off on some tangent." I said this, which was going to help the club. So it was things like that, slowly began to work on me. And then one day I finally sat down and I said, "Let's talk this through." And we got on the phone to talk it through. And nothing was listened. Nothing I said was accepted. Everything I said was wrong. I said, "Listen, let me just do this. I think it's better we just part ways." I said, "I've got better things to do with my life." I said, "I've got so much to do." I said, "I'm way behind. I've devoted so much time to this that other things have gotten behind, and it's not that big a deal." Which recently somebody posted something about I quit because I was so busy and I have so many other projects. That's not why I quit. I quit because you cannot deal with some of the people on the executive board. They want things done their way, which is why the other 5 or 6 board members left as well. I mean, there's been a mass exodus of people leaving the executive board of the Cauliflower Alley Club over the past several years. So it's obvious where the problem lies.
I asked you a little earlier how someone gets on the executive board. How does someone leave the executive board other than resignation? Is there any other mechanism?
Well, that you can be voted off. Any position can be, well, let me qualify that. One of the other things I did was set up new bylaws. I scoured the internet for bylaws of nonprofit corporations, and I worked for 2 solid weeks on that. So, because here's the problem. We get in a board meeting on telephone, and we have no guidelines, no bylaws. So somebody says, "Well, let's do it this." Well, we don't want to do it that way. We want to have something to say. We'll say, well, the bylaws say we have to do it this way. In other words, the vice president can't just say, well, listen, I want this done and I'm going to have my way or nothing. You can't do that. If you got a bylaws that say the majority of the board has to vote for a certain issue, or majority of the board has to vote to give out money or whatever, then you've got something you can hang your hat on. You can go back and say, okay, say the bylaws say this, so we have got to do it this way. But that's not the way things are done. Things are pretty much done, everybody glad handing each other. Somebody wants one thing done, and I'm okay with that. If you can convince somebody to change their mind, there's nothing wrong with that. But I don't know. What was your question? I forgot now.
About how someone would be removed from the board if they were going to be removed beyond them resigning.
One of the things in the bylaws that I put was that to leave the executive board, you either have to resign or 2/3 of the board members have to vote them off. And that stands for any position. So that's pretty much how that works. Other than that, you just, if you're tired of being on it, you just resign. That's it, and there's nothing much they can say or do. You don't have a contract. You're not, legally obligated to stay.
Were your bylaws adopted by CAC?
I went round and round and round. We kept saying, we got to talk about them. And then we talk about them. And then Brian emailed me. I still got all these emails. He says, Scott, you and I need to have a call together about these bylaws. He wanted to write them the way he wanted to write them. He wanted them to say what he wanted them to say. And I said, no. I said, we need to do this as a board. The board needs to do this. I said, what I'd like, and I wanted to do it where it didn't waste a lot of my time. What was said was, well, let's get on the board and we'll talk about it article by article. And I said, no. I say, you write down your concerns. I was telling the whole board this. I said, write down your concerns, what you like about it. If you've got a problem with one of the articles, then send it to me. I'll put them all together into the bylaws as questions and, things that people have said, comments. That way, when we get on the line, we can tackle just those things. We don't have to go through. It's a 5-page bylaws I wrote. So we don't have to tackle every single little article. We just go through and tackle the things somebody has a problem with. Okay. Somebody says, okay, or it says in the bylaws, board member can only be removed with a vote of 75% of the standing board members. Okay. Somebody has a problem with that. We get there and we say, okay, let's talk about this. I think we could do it with 50%. We ought to be able to remove somebody with 50%. And we discuss that. But why discuss every single little article where nobody has any problem with? But they didn't want to do that. Brian wanted me to call him and him and I talk about it so that we could work out, he thought I was going to just let him work out what he wanted on it. And that's in part the whole problem. Brian has his way of doing things. I have my way of doing things. Since I resigned, he told somebody I was a control freak. Yeah, I was a control freak, except I didn't control anybody else. I just controlled what I did, which was just about everything. I did as much as I could for the benefit of the club. So if that makes me a control freak, great. I'm a control freak.
In your eyes, because I've heard this from other people, so I'm going to ask you your opinion. Did Brian treat the CAC like it was his personal, I won't even use the word business because I'm going to assume that he's not profiting off it. But did he treat it like it was his own project? Like he was in charge, and obviously he's the president and CEO, but that he was in charge and that everything was going to be done exactly the way he wants it?
That's a hard question to answer. I never really got that. But here's what I did get. Before Brian, there was a president, an executive vice president, a secretary, a treasurer. Brian came in and he wanted to be CEO. He wanted this big title. And to me, it's not about who is who has what title. This is about a nonprofit organization that's set up to help people in financial, people who need financial help. But he had to be the CEO. And at one point he even felt like when the board voted on something, if it wound up as a tie, that he got a second vote as a CEO. So that was, to me, I don't understand that. Why do you got to be the CEO? Be the president. Forget the CEO stuff, but that was his big thing. He wanted to be, quote unquote, the CEO of the Cauliflower Alley Club. Nobody has ever done that before. So that tells me a little bit about, what his attitude may be as far as the way he looks to people. He wants to be the big honcho, and I couldn't care less about it. I did everything I could do to help the club without all that extra. I didn't go around and say, oh, I should be. In fact, I heard that somebody else had been arguing with Brian because they wanted to be the CEO. This before I came along. And that was part and parcel why one of the executive board members left, because they had this big argument at CAC in front of everybody. And it's things like this just constant with the CAC. It just over and over and over. And I don't want that in my life. I just want to live my retirement, have a great life, enjoy what I do. I want to enjoy writing about wrestling, researching about wrestling. I don't need this other garbage.
What do you think could be done to improve things? Do you see any mechanism to improve the way the board of directors is run, the way the office of president and I guess CEO is handled? What could actually be done from that level? Not necessarily the nuts and bolts of the reunion, but as an actual body, what could be done to improve CAC from your point of view?
That's just a hard thing to say. People are people. They're going to react like they're going to react. Some people work better together than others. Some people want total control. Some people don't want to, that if they want something, whether everybody else agrees or not. It's really a hard thing to say. To me, they simply need people whose only interest is advancing the CAC to help them help other people financially, and with no other pre-existing motive. And I don't, Dean Silverstone, that's his heart and soul, is all he thinks about is how can we help people? How can we help people financially? Brian's, his is raising money. And granted, it's to help people, but I think it's too much on, we got to raise money. We got to make money here. Got to sell these tickets, or if we don't sell these tickets right away, we're not going to make as much as we ever have. And it just, it's just got to be somebody that's got a real heart for what they're doing. And I hear that from Brian, but I just don't, I think the problem is in the attitude towards the people who he works with is what sets people off. That's why the other board members, and these board members I'm talking about that left, they had been there years and years and years and had been working with the CAC for decades. And for all of a sudden, 5 or 6 of them to just up and quit, that tells you a little something.
Again, I've heard different things from different people. One of the things I've heard, and tell me if you think this is fair, is that Brian was more interested in being a boss and being in a lot of ways a politician and schmoozing than actually being a boss and running things in an efficient manner or being an executive in charge of the company. It seemed that he was more interested in being a boss, according to other sources I have on this. Do you think that's fair?
I would have to say, based on what I saw, that's exactly how he acted, because he didn't serve any function at the reunion as far as taking care of this or making sure a table had something on it. And to me, I don't care who you are. If that's too menial for you to do, that's a shame, because I did everything I could to help that reunion, set up, break down. But to me, unless a person is actively involved in doing things other than schmoozing, other than answering phone calls, other than answering emails, then anybody can do that. You need to be there in the trenches with the people who are really working. Roy Lucier, God bless him. That guy works harder than anybody I know at promoting the CAC, and the things he did at CAC to help out, he was always there. And I had so many people come up to me in the vendor room. Can I do this? Is there something I can do? Do you need me to work security? Do you need me to set up anything? Can I do this or what? Just let me know what you want. I got that all the time. But it's a shame I didn't get it from the people that I should have gotten it from, the people I needed the help from.
Scott, what led to your resignation and how did it happen? And let me also say that I've heard from other people, and you probably don't even know this, but I've heard things that Brian Blair has said about your leaving the board, and obviously he paints it in a completely different light. But what actually happened? What led to you leaving CAC, and how did it go down?
Well, it was exactly what I was saying a little bit ago. The phone call, I had a phone call with Brian, and he didn't seem willing to listen to why I was upset about the way things went down at the reunion, but he wanted to nitpick these little things. And that's fine. But at the same time, if all he's wanting to do is nitpick the little things and not understand what I was going through, the angst I went through that weekend trying to take care of all those jobs, then I just didn't want to be a part of it. It just made me realize, why am I doing this? And that's what I told him when it just got to a point. I said, Brian, this isn't going to go any farther. So we're not going to get anywhere. I said, as of right now, I'm just going to resign. I said, I got too much life to live, too many things I want to do, and nothing against the CAC, but let's just move ahead. Y'all can do your thing. I hope that I've given a lot of ideas that you can move forward with, that you can take and run with. And I'm just through. And I said, thank you very much for the opportunity. I enjoyed the time I had. I said, and I'll talk to you later. And that was it.
Some of the reports I heard from people, and it wasn't even just CAC, I think it may have also been the Hall of Fame in Waterloo, Iowa, was about Brian's health. Was his health an issue at CAC?
I think, well, yeah. Brian had a lot of back problem. I mean, his back was absolutely, he was in agony, and I say the agony with a capital A. And God bless him, he had so much pain, it was unbelievable. But that didn't affect, that wasn't the cause of why he didn't help me or help, come up and try and help me or give me ideas or come up and explain things or any of that. It's just because he didn't do it. But yes, his health was really bad. He's had a back operation since then. I don't know what the results are. I haven't heard anybody say he's still in a lot of pain, but then again, I really haven't, like you said at the beginning, I haven't been around, I don't pay any attention to Facebook anymore, hardly. I'm sort of moved on to some other things. And so I'm not really in the loop like I used to be.
Have you heard that Brian Blair has mentioned to people that you were fired from CAC?
Absolutely. Rocky Johnson told me that with his own lips, and which was a result of me having some problems with Rocky as well later on. But yeah, Rocky told me that Brian said he fired me. And then he said another reason I left. Then in another breath, Brian told him that I left because I was upset because my wife couldn't be on the board. Well, number one, she did so much at registration, handled it smoothly, that during one of our board meetings, Dean Silverstone brought up the fact that we ought to add Angela because we needed somebody to fill Gloria Lovel's spot as recording secretary and handle registration. So he brought up the fact that we vote on Angela as a new member of the executive board. Brian, of course, took it upon himself to just raise. He didn't like it. He says, well, if she does, then I say if we bring her on, then she doesn't get a vote because it's not right for a husband and wife to be on here and both of them have a vote. Well, Chris and Tom Drake had a vote. They were on the board together. And it isn't like, and that to me said, I even asked Brian, I said, Brian, do you think I would vote on anything or Angela would not vote against something that I vote for if she didn't believe in it? He said, oh, no. I said, well, then it shouldn't matter. I said, if she votes her conscience and she votes what's best for the CAC, regardless of what I vote, then it shouldn't matter. I said, she will do the job. And I said, not only that, but she's doing the job. She's handling registration. She's doing all kinds of stuff for this. Not only registration, you won't believe the things she brought to the table at the reunion. I'm talking about decorations and candy on the tables for everybody, just one thing after another. You won't believe she has so many good ideas on, she's a party person. She loves doing things like that. So she brought a lot to the table. So actually, I'm digress here, but she actually was on the board. Now the question is, Brian, when I emailed him about it, and he says, well, I came in at the end of a conversation and I didn't say anything. I didn't get into it. I said, well, that's funny because Rocky seemed to know about my wife being on the executive board. I said, but the funny thing about that is nobody else knew about it except the board members. We had never announced it. We had never told anybody. I never told anybody. The only people that knew was me, Brian, Carl, Royal, and Dean. And yet Rocky Johnson knew about it. So I know good and well that Brian Blair told Rocky Johnson that I was upset because my wife couldn't be on the board. Rocky had it twisted. He didn't understand what Brian had said, I guess. But that wouldn't even have been brought up if Brian hadn't said something to it. So, yes. There's things been said. Like I said, one person he told I was a control freak. And there's been other things other people have told me. So.
Is it fair to say that Brian Blair is a control freak, too? I mean, is it something where, I mean, you admitted it. You said I can be a control freak. Do you think he can be as well, or do you think it's the opposite?
Well, to me, as far as the way he treated me, I think he was. To tell me I was in charge of registration. And two other things, when Ben Brown called Brian to say and said, Ben Brown is in charge of the WWE talent. He called Brian and he says, Brian, I need to get the WWE talent in through the back door. Brian says, well, that's Scott Teal's job. Let me give you his phone number. So all of a sudden I'm in charge of getting the WWE talent in. So, and then there was signs had to be put on the table. Somebody said, well, Brian, we need these signs put on the table. Or the signs aren't correct or something. And Brian says, well, that's Scott Teal. Give Scott Teal a call. He'll take care of everything he did. Oh, the other thing was auctions. Somebody had some items they wanted to donate for a silent auction. So they came to me and they said, Brian told me to see you because you're in charge of, we have some auctions to be donated. And he told us that you were the one in charge of that. So everything was in charge. So as far as being a control freak, if Brian he was trying to control me. I'm talking about from beginning to end. Everything was Scott Teal's responsibility. So, yeah, that could be. But I'm not a control freak, except I want to control what I'm responsible for. If I'm responsible for registration, if I'm responsible for the vendor room, you can bet I'm a control freak because I'm going to get it done right. I'm going to make sure it's done right.
So it seems that Brian does a lot of delegation. Is that fair?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
After you resigned, is there anything that comes out of it after that? Do you talk to Dean Silverstone, who you've known for years? What happens with these other board members that also resigned? Can you shed any light on the aftermath of your resignation?
I had a couple that were on the board before that had resigned that, in a nice, funny way, said, I told you so, because they had warned me. They had told me exactly how Brian was. And so I told him, I said, I get along with Brian fine. Brian's good. I have no problems with him, But yeah, I had people that emailed me and said, I told you that this would happen because this is what he did with us. And the horror stories I've heard, it's just unbelievable. But yeah, I've had people, come to me and say that they know the problems. I've had a lot of people say that have given me things. They say, we understand this because, this is about CAC, blah, blah, blah. And we've been asking for this to be changed or this person to be honored. And, all that's, it's a hard thing to do. But I've had so many people come to me with their problems with the CAC since then.
Boom! There it is, my conversation with Scott Teal. You will hear him again on the show in a few weeks. Part 2 of this conversation dealing with the Rocky Johnson book, Soul Man, that was written by Scott Teal for ECW Press, will be airing then. And I think a lot of people will really want to hear that interview. Again, that book is now a hot commodity. It is a collector's item. It has been pulled from the market by ECW Press. You will hear the entire story as to why on the Super Podcast. Either episode 102 or 103, more than likely episode 102, quite honestly. But with that said, as we begin to wrap things up, want to make a few notes here. Of course, there are various ways you can support the Super Podcast. If you would like to make a one-time donation to the production of this show, you could do so. PayPal.me/Superpodcast or on an ongoing monthly basis, Patreon.com/Superpodcast. Unlike other shows, this is not a Patreon account where you get bonus content. You merely support the Super Podcast and the production of the show, and quite frankly, the production of all Arcadian Vanguard shows. PayPal.me/Superpodcast or Patreon.com/Superpodcast. Of course, use our Amazon links, tinyurl.com/Superpod, Amazon. By using that link, you support this show. You don't do anything differently than you would normally do, but you show a little bit of love and support to us, as does our good friends over at Amazon.com, tinyurl.com/superpod, Amazon. And also don't forget, if you want a t-shirt, stickers, magnets, whatever it may be, the official Super Podcast store, tinyurl.com/superpod store. I want to make mention once again that this episode of the Super Podcast was brought to you by our friends, the wrestling fans over at Ramsor Records, RAMSEUR. Don't forget ramsorrecords.kungfustore.com. On sale right now, the brand new album by David Childers, Interstate Lullaby. Check it out today. Also, if you want to follow the show, you can on Twitter. We are at 605pod, or you can follow me at Great Brian Last, or the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network at Super Podcasts. Also on Facebook, facebook.com/superpodcast. The 605 Super Podcast is a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network. For all of our guests this week, I'm the Great Brian Last. Tally ho!